Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host Simon. Welcome. This is The Whitaker Family, Murder and Treachery in Sugarland, written by Danny, read by yours truly, that's me. A charming photograph taken in December 2003 depicts all four members of the Whitaker family gleefully wrapping up a celebratory seafood meal at the Papa Do restaurant in Stafford, Texas. Papa Do sounds fancy. It's written in that French way, D-E-U-X, Papa Do. Just a 5-minute drive from their home in the city of Sugarland. Is that a real place? Sugarland? Really? Less than 20 minutes after this final photograph was taken, the Whitaker family would be ripped in half when they returned home and immediately stepped into a nightmare. A disturbing visit from an armed intruder, which rapidly led to the shooting of all four family members. Jesus Christ, drop me right in it, why don't you, Danny? The restaurant meal was meant to be in honor of 23-year-old Bart Whitaker's graduation from college. He's accompanied in the photo by his proud parents, Kent and Trish, and his 19-year-old brother Kevin, who also appeared to be on course for a bright future. But by the end of the evening, at least 2 members of the Whitaker family would be brutally denied any kind of future, whilst life would throw further sinister surprises and dark revelations for anyone fortunate enough to survive the horrendous ordeal that was awaiting them back home. The story of the Whitaker family is a story of deception and betrayal, but it's also quite a staggering story of forgiveness, as a survivor of the carnage chose to spend well over a decade campaigning to save the life of the condemned inmate on death row who'd been deemed responsible. Fucking hell, why? It was a fight for clemency that would continue right up until the very day of the scheduled execution. And whilst detectives soon found themselves on the trail of an injured former US soldier who was working in a furniture store in Mexico, it was ultimately revealed that the real architect of the ghastly murder plot could be found much closer to home in the syrupy heart of Sugarland. Just before we continue, a quick shout out for today's sponsor, Sheath Underwear. Easily the most comfortable boxers I've ever owned. I'm wearing them right now. That was pain. No, I just had it tucked onto my leg. I am wearing some Sheath, but I couldn't, that wouldn't be just physically not possible, is it? These are Sheath. They are the most comfortable underwear you'll ever wear. I promise you that. You'll get one pair. Just go buy one pair. I should probably say buy a dozen pairs. The sponsor would be happy, but just buy one pair to start with. Get it in your drawer, and you'll be like, you know, where you find something and it's your favorite thing, and then you're waiting for it to go through the wash to come back around. That is what will happen when you get Sheath, and then you just end up buying more Sheath until your entire delicates drawer, what do you call it, where you keep your underwear, cupboard, is full of Sheath. It's fantastic. It's basically designed for dudes with dude parts, because we have dude parts, and it gets stuck together and all of this. I was never a briefs guy because it's too tight. Boxers were what I went to before I had Sheath, but it's just a better system. It's just different compartments for your different parts. It's just better. Like I said, I've replaced all of my underwear with these, and it's as simple as that. You should too. I have left the talking points behind. I apologize, but just a good product. Go to sheath.com/criminalist and use the code criminalist to get 20% off your order. That's sheath.com/criminalist, code criminalist for 20% off. To be honest with you, I'd never heard of the city of Sugarlands before. Not surprised, Danny, me neither. Before I started researching this script, I originally envisioned an enchanting wonderland of chocolate rivers, candy bushes, and toffee apple trees, ruled over by Mayor Willy Wonka and governed largely by Oompa Loompas. Careful, Danny. We don't want to get in trouble with the rights holders of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I definitely knew that and didn't have to think about it for a second. Whilst it's not quite as magical as that, Sugarland in Fort Bend County, Texas, still sounds like a pretty lush place to live. Okay. The area was originally a massive sugar plantation. Well, that's where it gets its name from, isn't it? In the 19th century, evolving into a self-contained company town for the Imperial Sugar Company in 1909. These days, it's more of a sugar-free alternative. Whilst the Imperial Sugar Company HQ is still planted there, the Imperial Sugar Company, is that really still a company? It sounds so colonial. The sugar refinery and distribution centers have long since dissolved, and now Sugarland is one of the fastest growing cities in Texas. Well, good for them. but you certainly need more than a few bucks in the bank to settle down in this affluent, desirable, and reassuringly safe suburb with incredibly low crime rates. Uh-oh. The Whitaker family were clearly doing all right for themselves as they'd lived in Sugarland for many tablespoons by the year 2003. 51-year-old Patricia, known to her friends as Trish, and 54-year-old Kent first met on a blind date back when they were in their early 20s. They discovered that they instantly clicked, but unlike many contemporary young couples, this wasn't down to a mutual interest in Pink Floyd, platform shoes, magic mushrooms, and not washing your hair for several years. They bonded over a mutual love of our Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ, who died for all our sins. I don't know, I'm laughing. This is probably more common than people bonding over a love for Pink Floyd. Like, lots of people love Jesus. Yes, Trish and Kent were very much into their faith and would describe, is that why he forgives the killer? Because he's just so into Jesus and forgiveness and stuff. Wait, isn't the Bible all like eye for an eye, motherfucker? And he's like, no, I'll forgive you for murdering half my family. They were devoted Christians, choosing Sunday services and Bible studies over Led Zeppelin concerts and LSD. Trish later got a job as an elementary school teacher, while Kent became the controller and part owner of a big construction company. And their personal lives weren't all about following the word of the Lord and forgiving those who sin against us so that we ourselves can be forgiven for our own sins by the Heavenly Father. Jesus, Danny, preaching. Preach, Danny! They were also quite similar to me in many ways, that they were energetic types with a passion for the outdoors. I don't know, Danny, everything I know about you, you have a passion for the outdoors? Trish and Kent enjoyed cycling, skiing, horseback ride. I just can't imagine Danny riding a horse for some reason. Maybe Danny does love the outdoors. Maybe I've misread Danny. I just can't imagine him riding a horse. And lots of other things that I've read about in books. Well, there we go. There we go. Everything is right in the world. 2 became 3 in 1979 when Trish gave birth to Thomas Bartlett Whitaker, more commonly known to his friends and family simply as Bart. I nearly forgot to say that they were married at this point, but you must have guessed that already. Yes, they were super into Jesus. Of course they were. Bart got into biking from a very young age and later enjoyed some pretty epic rides with his dad, clocking up an estimated 15,000 miles together. That is a lot of miles. Widely considered to be cool, witty, good-looking, and a hit with the ladies, Bart did get into a bit of mischief at school when he was younger, but I'm confident that his parents forgave him. And he appeared to have matured into a good, studious boy in later years. Yes, fine, everyone gets into a little bit of trouble. In 2003, Bart was fast approaching his graduation from Sam Houston State University over in Huntsville, Texas. His time in higher education had obviously moved him out of the family home back in Sugarland, but his life as a student was heavily supported by his wealthy parents who even went as far as to buy him a nice lakeside townhouse within driving distance of the university. You suspect that Bart wasn't the type of student who ever had to worry about where his pot... Wait, did we just say they bought him a house? A lakeside town? I just completely glossed over that. I was like, oh yeah, completely normal, buying him a house, a lakeside townhouse. I'm like, wait, what? They bought him a house? Fucking hell, that's proper money right there. 3 became 4 in 1984 when Kevin Whitaker was born, completing the family photograph. Kevin had a minor learning disability, which led Trish to give up her job as a teacher so that she could provide extra care and help for her younger son, although she still volunteered at the school from time to time. Kevin was a little quieter than his older brother and was considered to be the sensitive one. He very much looked up to cool dude Bart and perhaps even idolized him a little. But Kevin was a popular guy in his own right with a large circle of friends, and he was doing well in his own studies as he was embarking on his second year at university. It's reported that he was possibly eyeing up a future career in the military. The Whitaker family got on particularly well with their relatively new neighbours, Cliff and Darlene Stanley, and they would often go out together for meals or cinema trips. On lazier evenings, they would all just chill out in the Whitakers' front yard and rattle on all night until the sun went down. Kent and Trish were often considered to be second parents to some of Bart and Kevin's friends, and the welcoming household was seen by many teenagers as the best place to hang out in Sugarland. And as we reached the end of 2003, a big dollop of good news was sprinkled over the lives of this popular family. On the morning of the 10th of December, Bart phoned his parents to tell them that he would be driving over from Huntsville to meet up with them that evening. He'd just finished his very last exams at Sam Houston State University, and he was feeling confident that he'd be sailing through graduation and well on track to begin the next big chapter of his life, which was reportedly might have involved pursuing a career in law enforcement. In the meantime, Bart was in a mood to celebrate. He suggested that the family meet up for a meal at the Papadou restaurant in Stafford, and I expect that Kent and Trish would be footing the bill. Not that they would have minded, of course, as they were naturally excited to see Bart again and incredibly proud of everything that he had achieved. Well, isn't that fantastic? In fact, they had another expensive surprise for Bart when they arrived at the restaurant, a graduation gift in the form of a Rolex, worth about $4,000. $4,000 ain't gonna get you much of Rolex these days. A little premature, perhaps, as he'd not technically graduated, but Bart had no qualms about accepting it, as he'd always dreamed of owning a Rolex. How old is he? Like 23? Shit. Kent, Trish, Bart and Kevin enjoyed a seafood meal together, followed by dessert, which in Bart's case had the words "congratulations" composed in chocolate syrup on the edge of the plate. Everybody appeared to be in good spirits, as we can see from the photograph that was taken on the night, including a snap of the two grinning brothers in which Bart is cheekily flipping the bird to whoever was behind the camera. The final photograph, in which all four members of the family are still alive, was snapped less than 10 minutes before the Whitakers left the Papadou restaurant to take the very short drive back to the family home in Sugarland, where they intended to carry on the celebrations. But these plans were to be cut brutally short as soon as they walked through the front door. Two cars arrived out back of the Whitaker family home at around 8:20 p.m. Kent, Trish, and Kevin had traveled back home in Kent's Chevrolet Trailblazer, whilst Bart was driving his Chevrolet Yukon, in which he had made the journey from Huntsville to the restaurant. The Yukon had been an earlier very welcome gift from Ma and Pa. It's quite a nice car, right? The Chevrolet Yukon, if I'm picturing it correctly. After parking up, Bart jumps out of the car and begins strolling towards the front door, but then he suddenly realizes that he's left his cell phone behind in the car, so he turns around and heads back to retrieve it. It's a careless lapse of memory, which may or may not have saved Bart's life. In the meantime, Kevin is now first to the door, which he promptly unlocks and then steps into the house, with Trish just a few steps behind. Kent has held back for a while to wait for Bart. As soon as Kevin steps inside the house, into the dining room, he realizes he's not alone. He finds himself facing a man dressed entirely in black, his face hidden by a black ski mask, and he's holding a gun, which is now pointing directly at Kevin. It was later revealed that Kevin's surprising reaction was to smile warmly at the masked intruder. Oh, we all do strange shit when we're stressed out. It's like, hey, what are you doing here, masked intruder with a gun? At this stage, we don't have a clue why. Did Kevin recognize a friendly face under the ski mask? Oh, that's an alternative, isn't it? But I'd still be like, even if it was a friendly face, I'd be like, what are you doing in my house wearing a ski mask, bro? Why'd you have a gun? What the bro? Was he in on the loop of what was going down here, or did he just think it was somebody having a laugh? If he had just a little bit more time, he may well have recognized the gun. But the masked intruder is clearly not having a laugh. He fires the gun directly into the chest of Kevin, who falls to the floor. Trish then steps into the dining room and only has time to let out a shocked gasp before she too is shot in the chest and falls onto her back. Kent now walks into the house and clocks the intruder, but doesn't see that his wife and youngest son are on the floor. Kent initially believes that one of Kevin's goofy friends is playing a silly prank on them all with a paintball gun. He soon realizes that this is not the case at all. The intruder shoots Kent in the left chest, and the bullet gets lodged in his shoulder as he falls. Finally, Bart enters the house after having picked up the phone from his car. Unlike the other members of his family, Bart actually had time to assess the situation as he walked into the dining room and immediately sprung into action, launching himself violently at the intruder. Who's got a gun? He's just fucking going for it. Yes! Don't scratch that Rolex, though. The two wrestle on the floor for a few moments before the gun goes off. Bart has been shot in the upper arm and slumps to the floor in agony as the intruder finally decides that this might be a good time to flee the scene. Kent is still alive, but unable to move as he begins to process that everyone around him has been shot. The only noise he can hear is his wife, quietly coughing a few yards away. A very specific cough that he recognizes as the sound of someone trying to clear their lungs as they fill with blood. Bro, why would you recognize that sound? Where have you heard before someone clearing their lungs of blood? He later revealed at this point that he made a silent appeal to God. Father, you know, if it's my time to die, I'm ready. It's okay. But protect my family. Alas, events were not destined to pan out the way that Kent had requested. The neighbour, Cliff Stanley, was first on the scene. He had been enjoying a night in front of the TV when he heard the sounds of gunshots from next door and immediately rushed over to see what was going on. After first finding Kent on the floor and bleeding badly, Cliff whipped off his t-shirt in an attempt to stem the flow. Kent urged Cliff to get out of the house as the armed intruder could still be present, but Cliff was going nowhere, legend, and the intruder had already made his exit. After quickly checking on the others, Cliff dialed 911. Kent was still dazed, confused, and unable to move by the time the police arrived at the house. The first he knew that at least one of his family was dead was when he overheard a couple of officers having a quiet discussion about what they should do about the DOA. Bro, come on, guys. At this point, a horrified Kent had no idea which one of his family was already dead. Cliff Stanley was already aware of this, as he'd been trying his best to attend to everyone whilst waiting for the police to arrive. In Cliff's own words, I could see Kevin clearly, and Kevin was finished. The bullet penetrated Kevin's heart and killed the 19-year-old student instantly. The homicide detective, Marshall Slott, had just got back home from church when he got the call to hotfoot it to Sugarland to investigate reports of a quadruple shooting. Slott initially assumed the cause was a wind-up. Even a report of a stolen wheelbarrow would have been a bit far-fetched in somewhere as idyllic and thoroughly wholesome as Sugarland. Marshall Slott would go on to take the lead role of detective in this uncharacteristically grim case, which was far from what he first imagined. His initial gut feeling was that this was a case of disturbed burglary. Fair enough, it's a rich part of town, kind of makes sense that someone would be there for a burglary, which had spiraled into deadly chaos when the family unexpectedly returned home and walked into a hail of bullets from a panicked intruder. But just how many lives had this masked man savagely taken? Kevin wasn't the only victim to be declared dead on the scene. Trish was in the most urgent need of medical treatment and was airlifted to Memorial Hermann Hospital, but sadly she died from the gunshot wounds before she even made it there. Bart was taken to hospital, but his life had never been in serious danger, as his heroic efforts to apprehend the intruder had only resulted in a bullet in the upper arm. It was a different story for Kent, who had been critically injured in the attack and remained in hospital for quite some time. However, he had had something of a lucky escape, as the bullet had missed his heart by inches. He would eventually go on to make a full recovery. Afterwards, Bart would move back in with his dad in Sugarland for several months, and they apparently spent a lot of time talking and reading the Bible together. An atrocity like this may have been enough to test anyone's faith in the existence of a benevolent cosmic architect or celestial gardener, but to be fair, it was Kent's faith that pulled him out of the depths of despair. Back when he was in hospital, he admitted that he was utterly consumed by hatred for the man who had murdered his wife and youngest son. Yeah, as you would be. And he spent his days imagining the most terrible ways in which he could inflict pain upon the killer. He realized that he was drifting onto a dark path of unholy vengeance, which was only going to push him ever deeper into hopeless anguish. So he made a decision. During one of Bart's frequent hospital visits, Kent declared to his son that he had decided to forgive the murderer. Bro, you're still in hospital. After getting shot, you're already like, no, Dude, I could not, dude. I just could not. Ken later revealed that as soon as he had made this decision, he felt immersed in a warm glow as the fire and anger evaporated. It's understandable that Bart may not have felt quite as forgiving as his father. During the joint funeral service for Trish and Kevin Whitaker held at Sugar Creek Baptist Church on the 16th of December 2003, an event which attracted over 1,000 people, it was noted by several guests that Bart was visibly raging. At one point, he angrily promised to a couple of his friends that we're going to find who did it. The police were hoping to get there before Bart. One of the first pieces of evidence picked up by Detective Marshall Slott and his team when they arrived on the scene was a single black glove, which was found near the back of the house. This initially led Slott to inwardly groan that he could be facing another OJ, a reference to the infamous 1995 trial of O.J. Simpson, in which a blood-stained glove became central to a case which would still have been fresh in the memory at this point. Kent and Bart's statements to the police were not proving to be incredibly helpful, as they didn't seem to agree with each other. Admittedly, There probably wasn't very much of value that either of them could say after having been shot by a man in a black ski mask, but their attempts to describe anything they possibly could about the killer revealed that they didn't remember things in the same way. Which, I mean, is kind of fair, right? You're going to be under a lot of stress in a situation like this. Your memories can get muddled. Bart felt the killer was black. He admitted that he wasn't entirely sure about this, but that's the impression that he got after wrestling on the floor with him for a few moments. In contrast, Kent felt more certain that the killer was white, as he remembered glimpsing little patches of white skin around the eye holes of the mask. But Bart wasn't convinced by this and still felt more likely the intruder was black. So at least we've narrowed things down a bit, and the police can now feel confident that they're looking for an unknown man in a ski mask who is either white or black. Brilliant. At least we know it's a dude. However, slightly more insightful points were picked up at the house, most important of which turned out to be the murder weapon. The gun that was used to murder Trish and Kevin Whitaker actually belonged to Kevin. It was a 9mm Glock handgun, which had been given to Kevin on his birthday by Bart. The unloaded gun was stored in a small metal safe in a built-out crawl space in Kevin's bedroom. The safe had been crudely, but effectively prized open by the intruder. I don't feel your gun safe should be prizable. Someone breaks into a house and then they break into the gun safe and they've got a gun. It doesn't seem particularly secure, guys. The gun had been discarded by the intruder on the kitchen floor, which was perhaps a slightly odd thing to do. Perhaps he was hoping to implicate Kevin in the murder, which wouldn't have made an awful lot of sense, as Kevin was the first victim of his own gun. Yes, not the brightest spark there. It could have just been that the intruder had no qualms about leaving behind the murder weapon, as it wasn't going to prove anything in itself. He was likely to have been wearing gloves throughout his time in the Whitaker home, and no fingerprints were ever detected on the weapon. There was something odd about the ammunition that was used in the attack, though. The 4 shell casings found on the floor were Carbon 9mm Parabellum ammunition, yet no Carbon ammunition was reported to be present in the Whitaker home at the time. It all gets increasingly suspicious from here on in. There was no sign whatsoever of forced entry, and the only thing to have been taken from the Whitaker home during the burglary was an undisclosed but apparently quite substantial pile of cash that Kent kept well hidden in the wardrobe of the master bedroom. Bro, you not heard of a safe, Kent? Why not get a safe? You're clearly rich. Get a safe. I've got a big-ass safe in my house. It's awesome. I just like having a safe. You're like, and it opens. It's nice. Please don't rob me. There's nothing in there, just documents. I'm trying to think of non-valuable things people keep it safe. Title deeds in my name. I don't think title deeds are still a thing, are they? Do you have a title deed to your house? Is that still a thing? I think it's just online these days, isn't it? To the untrained eye, the crime scene may well have indicated that a chaotic burglary had just taken place, as the drawers to the master bedroom had all been pulled open, and everything generally just looked a bit messy. But to the highly trained eyes of Detective Marshall Slott and his team, it looked like a suspiciously tidy mess. The dresser's drawers had all been opened at almost exactly the same length, but nothing inside any of the drawers appeared to have been disturbed at all. Been staged, hasn't it? Staged. You would imagine that a typical burglar would just instinctively pocket any shiny, sparkly things or expensive items that they came across. Yet this burglar had completely ignored just about all of the high-value stuff that was in plain sight, including expensive jewelry, computers, video recording equipment, and all kinds of stuff that could be easily shifted down at the Moonshine Roadhouse. If I was burgling, though, and I knew there was cash, I'd take the cash, because it's untraceable, basically. No one's writing down those serial numbers. But I did know a friend of mine's dad. I always remember this. I can't remember where it was, but sometime he was like, they gave him the wrong change. And he's like, oh, you gave me the wrong change. I gave you a 20. And the guy's like, no, you didn't. You gave me a 10. And he's like, all right, take the last 20 out of your till and I'll tell you the last 4 numbers of it. And I'm like, that's so clever. Every time he handed over cash, he'd just memorize the last 4 digits of any bill so that he could always prove if someone gives him the wrong change, that he did give them the right money. And I'm like, that's really clever. I always remember that. Anyway, cash is untraceable. Jewelry and stuff, if you're not a professional robber or something, if this is your first time, you're not going to have a fence. You're going to know the dodgy pawn shop where to offload it. I feel that that's much more risky. Instead, it appears that the intruder had let themselves into the house without the need for forced entry, and just opened a few drawers very neatly during a half-hearted attempt to make it look like a random burglary. He had then ignored all the big, glittering prizes for the taking and zeroed in on just 2 items of interest in particularly obscure places: the pile of cash hidden in the wardrobe and the gun hidden safe in the crawl space. It's also mad suspicious that he knows there's a gun in the crawl space. That's the space below. I feel like we used to have a different word for it in the UK. It's like there's space but underneath ours, like a cellar or something, right? Or between the walls. But then you couldn't crawl in there, could you? Whenever I imagine crawl space, I imagine Bruce Willis working his way through a ventilation duct. What's more, he brought his own Corbon 9mm Parabellum ammunition, as he seemed to know that the 9mm Glock handgun would not be loaded and there would be no suitable ammunition in the house. It's almost as if the intruder had been given inside information and knew exactly what they were looking for and where they would find it. If I'm the detective slot, I'm already getting railroaded onto one of the family members and being like, it's you, isn't it? Or at least it's, who did we get suspiciously introduced to? Was it the neighbors? It's almost as if the intruder had been given inside information, and this led Detective Slot to conclude that this was not just some random burglary which was disturbed by the family with horrific consequences. Slot believed that the intruder had located and loaded the gun for a very specific reason and was waiting for the Whitaker family to return home. 5 days after the shootings, the first major lead came out of the woodwork. A young guy called Adam Hipp wandered into the Sugarland Police Department close to midnight and requested to speak to Detective Marshall Slot, as he had potentially useful information relating to the Whitaker family murders. The sergeant on duty paged Slot at home, and the detective dashed over to the police station. But Adam wasn't keen on chatting inside the station. Instead, the conversation was held in the parking lot outside. Okay. I guess that's kind of sensible. There could be listening devices inside a police station. Adam Hipp revealed to Detective Slot that he'd been approached a couple of years earlier by an individual who wanted to enlist his services in a plot to wipe out the Whitaker family. Is bro just admitting to being an assassin? He's he wanted to enlist my services. What services are those, mate? Oh, wiping out a family. You might want to come inside. Hipp admitted that he was initially interested in the offer, as there was apparently a huge payout awaiting him at the end of it, but the plan never went ahead. The mysterious individual who wanted the Whitaker family dead was a friend of Hipp's, and they had attended Clements High School in Sugarland together. His name was Thomas Bartlett Whitaker, but he was more commonly known to his friends and family as simply Bart. Oh no! Oh no, it's the son! I mentioned earlier that Bart got up to a bit of mischief during his time at school, but it was a little heavier than your typical schoolboy tomfoolery. And whilst he was regularly described as cool, witty, and studious, he could also be accurately described as a spoiled brat, a thieving scallywag, and a lying little shitbag. Oh no. Because I'm his dad's buying him that Rolex and that fancy car and stuff. My default position would be, no, children, no. But if they were extremely responsible and all of this, and were just generally not bags or whatever and spoiled and stuff, then I'd be like, okay, well, you can clearly handle it, can't you? But if they can't, then I'm gonna take it all away. Be like, Dad, can I have a car? No, you can't have any car. You can take the fucking bus. Get on the bus. By the age of 17, he'd already racked up a list of criminal convictions for masterminding several burglaries in which he'd roped in some of his more gullible friends. Bro is the burglar with a Rolex. What is happening? Details of these are a little sparse, but one of them involved the theft of several computers from his own high school, and it apparently involved Bart dangling from the ceiling on a rope. Had he recently seen Mission Impossible? Detective Slot later described the operation as Mission Impossible style burglary. Which, I know it's bad, but that is kind of cool. The response from Kent and Trish had been to take Bart out of Clements High School and to shove him in a private Christian school, and they might have convinced themselves that this had straightened out their wayward son and put him onto the path that would eventually lead to his graduation from Sam Houston State University. Except it had done no such thing. A reporter got in touch with the police to reveal that after a little bit of journalistic digging, he'd discovered that Bart was nowhere near graduating from Sam Houston State University. Although he had indeed been enlisted as a student for a few years, he had tested the patience of the university by frequently skipping classes, and at one point appeared to have thrown in the towel altogether. It's university, though. Who gives a shit if you skip classes? If you skip classes, you fail, and that's on you. You wasted all your money. It's not school. No one's taking attendance. People don't take attendance at American university, do they? I know there's some classes, like I think I had to take one class where there was no exam, so you had to attend and sit through all the lectures and all that bullshit. But for everything else, it was like, if there's an exam or a test, don't come to lectures. As long as you study, you could be fine, I guess. I don't know. I skipped a bunch of lectures if they were a bit boring. I skipped a bunch of lectures if I knew the topic wasn't going to come up on the exam, because first thing I did every year, go to the library, get out all of the previous exam papers from the last 20 years or whatever that have been made by that lecturer and work out what questions they never ask and then never study those questions. I'd just skip entire bits of the syllabus. Never was a problem. Didn't have a single question come up where I was like, can't answer that. Didn't study that because it never came up on the papers. And even if it did, you just resit the exam 3 months later. And you can literally study like half the shit. I know it's not right. It's kind of like not cheating, but it was a very lazy way to do studying. His status at the time of the murders was freshman on probation, which perhaps indicated that he intended to have another crack at it from square one, but any genuine graduation celebrations would have been far in the future at this point, if there were to be any at all. This was news to Kent Whitaker, who believed that his son had taken his final exams and had no idea that Bart was actually holding down a job in the food service department of Bentwater Yacht and Country Club near Lake Conroe in Montgomery, a job he appeared to take far more seriously than his supposed studies. You couldn't blame Kent for feeling a bit irked that his son had been lying to him the whole time while accepting an endless chain of lavish rewards, such as several luxury cars. What is happening? A Rolex watch. Oh, and that lakeside townhouse. He literally, I don't know why I was focused on the watch. He bought him a fucking house. What is happening? What are you doing? When confronted over his lies, Bart was quick to admit that he'd been telling porkies as he was afraid of letting the family down. But he did claim to have told the whole truth to his mother, who had been very supportive, and they'd been figuring out ways of breaking the news gently to the rest of the family. Very difficult to prove, of course, as Trish Whitaker was now hardly in the position to back this up. But his dad seemed happy enough with the explanation. I would have demanded that Bart hand back that $4,000 Rolex watch, though. Yeah, and sell the f***ing lake house. Also, I wouldn't sell that Rolex. Just hold on to it, because $4,000 for a Rolex is an insane price these days. That's just not happening. Bart's backstory does throw up disturbing insights into his behavior and his motives for theft. We do know that his parents spoiled him rotten. He didn't have to steal computers from his own school. Kent and Trish would have happily bought him as many computers as he wanted, along with a diamond-encrusted mouse and a printer that dispenses truffles. Yet he stole the computers anyway. Yeah, this isn't because he needs money from stolen computers. He just likes stealing shit because it's exciting. It's kleptomania. Or was it just for the thrill of it all, or did he really enjoy pissing people off? Whilst Kent remained steadfast in his support for his oldest son, Detective Slott was beginning to ponder over the idea that this lying little thief might just know something about the murders, and he wasn't letting on. And these suspicions only intensified after the chat in the parking lot with Adam Hipp. You see, Adam Hipp revealed that Bart had approached him in 2001 with a plan to kill 3 members of his own family. One of Bart's university roommates, named Justin Peters, had already been tasked with sourcing the gun, which would be handed over to Hipp, who had been given the role of shooter. Hipp was to provide Detective Slott with detailed diagrams of the layout of the Whitaker house. I keep wanting to read Whitaker as Whistler, which is my surname, because it looks so similar when written down. Just the same length, the shapes look the same. So he's providing detailed diagrams of the house and a full visual outline of how exactly the plot would unfold, complete with the little matchstick men to illustrate the journey of the shooter and the predicted locations of the 3 victims as they met their fate. The really striking thing here is the similarities between this earlier plot and the events that eventually unfolded in December 2003. Adam Hipp explained that Bart intended to take his family out for dinner, but he would leave the front door unlocked to allow Hipp easy access into the empty house. Hipp would wait in the house with the gun obtained by Justin Peters and then open fire on Kent, Trish, and Kevin as soon as they got back from the restaurant and walked through the dining room. Bart himself would find an excuse to hold back a little and ensure that he would be the last one to walk through the house. And get this, Hipp had been instructed to shoot Bart in the arm following a staged brawl to make it look as if Bart had been valiantly attempting to bring down the shooter and avoid any suspicion falling in his direction. If all of this was true, it sounded pretty much like the blueprint of the operation that was carried out in 2003. In fact, it sounded so similar that Detective Slott naturally began to wonder if Adam Hipp may have also been involved in the 2003 operation. I am amazed that Adam Hipp came forward. If I was Adam Hip, I'd be like, oh my god, he did it, but I was also planning to do it, which doesn't look good for me. I'm going to shut the f*** up and hope that no one ever brings this to me. You know, what's the statute of limitations on planning a murder? And be like, However, it was quickly proven that Adam had been working miles away on the night of the attack and couldn't possibly have been involved. It was a similar story with Justin Peters, who was tracked down by the police and completely backed up Adam Hip's story. Peters freely admitted that he had been indeed hired by Bart to get a hold of a gun back in 2001, but he was able to confirm his whereabouts during the 2003 shootings, and it was again clear that he was not involved in the actual murders. Both Hip and Peters explained that the reason why the earlier plot was abandoned was because word had spread around the school and it became too risky to proceed. This may have been the motivation for Adam Hip coming forward to the police in the first place. He knew that other people were aware of the earlier plot, and he wanted to make it clear that he had no part in the murders before detectives dragged up this sinister history. I'd still just shut the f*** up. I'd just wait for them to bring it to me. And if they did, then I'd have my story and my alibi and everything sorted out. And if they didn't, great. A point that we'll return to shortly is the claim from Justin Peters that the earlier 2001 plot wasn't even the first time that Bart had tried to rope in a few buddies to help wipe out his family. I don't like using the word wipe out. It's like just murder in cold blood his own family. An obvious question to ask right now is why on earth would a young man with such doting and generous parents who were happily funding his extravagant lifestyle feel the need to order their own deaths, along with the younger brother who looked up to Bart as if he were a superhero? Oh, money. Money. Because he's got to ask his parents for a Rolex or a car or a lake house. If they die, and everyone dies, he gets all the money and possibly a fat life insurance policy, right? Fucking savage if he murders them all. Their parents like, oh no, his dad lost his job like 6 months ago. He's deeply in debt. And now that debt is yours. And you killed him. That would be a lovely fuck you. Adam Hip had an answer for this. And it was all about more money. What? Yeah, I feel like quite obviously. With the rest of the family out of the picture, Bart would become the sole inheritor of an estate which he claimed was worth around $1.5 million. Wait. No. He's bought him multiple luxury cars. He bought him a lake house. He bought him a Rolex. The family's net worth is not $1.5 million. That's way under. And the two potential accomplices had been promised a sizable chunk of the family fortune if they carried out their side of the deal. Bart denied the allegations made by Adam Hip and Justin Peters, and of course it would have been difficult at this stage to prove his involvement in a secret plot that was ultimately abandoned. Kent Whitaker was also in denial, whilst Detective Marshall Slaw was delicately trying to explain to Kent that his son was now a suspect and could potentially be a vile monster. Kent refused to believe any of it on the grounds that such a concept was inconceivable because Bart dearly loved his family. I mean, yeah, look, obviously it seems a bit naive to us, but it's his son. Of course you'd believe him over the police who have like some half-baked theory that they can't prove. And even if you're like, ooh, maybe, you shut that up in a box and try not to think about it because it's so horrific. Kent must have felt confident about this, as Bart would continue to live with him for another 7 months, and you wouldn't ideally be wanting to share a house with somebody who was trying to have you killed. In the meantime, with a notable lack of any credible evidence, aside from the word of two dodgy geezers who agreed to take part in a murder plot, Detective Slot began to carefully chew over his next move. It looked as if Bart had hired 2 of his closest friends from high school to participate in the earlier plot, but both of those had been eliminated as suspects in the plan that went ahead. Bearing in mind that the plots were eerily similar, it could well be the case that Bart had recruited fresh accomplices for the 2003 version who may well have emerged from his current circle of closest friends. Well, yeah, of course. That's what we're all assuming is happening, right? 2 names immediately aroused the attention of detectives. A guy called Chris Brashear actually lived with Bart for a while in the townhouse in Huntsville and had also worked with him at the Bentwater Yacht and Country Club. Another guy called Stephen Champagne, great surname, lived just a few doors down from the townhouse and had worked as a bartender at the very same country club, a job which Bart had helped him to wangle. Both Chris Brashear and Stephen Champagne were brought in for questioning and flatly denied any involvement or inside knowledge of the murders. Brashear claimed that he did actually see Bart on that day in Huntsville, but it was much earlier when they were enjoying a spot of lunch together before Bart drove to Sugarland to meet his family. To help prove their innocence, they readily agreed to provide DNA samples and scent samples. Oh, is this for dogs? Is that even a thing? That's cool. The latter of which involved the collection of specimens of their scents, after which sniffer dogs were unleashed on the crime scene to see if they could pick up the exact same whiffs and pongs. Wow, that's pretty cool. Is that actual science? This actually proved to be a terrible idea for Chris Brashear, but I guess that refusing to provide the requested samples would have looked a bit dodgy, and he could have been pinning his hopes on all the scent detection dogs having a bit of an off day. The dogs in question were bloodhounds, who went by the cracking names of James Bond, Quincy, and Columbo. I like this. And the bad guy's called Stephen Champagne. Stephen Champagne sounds like a bad guy. Like, Champagne sounds like a James Bond villain surname. No, Mr. Champagne. I expect you to die. I know that's the bad guy saying it to James Bond, but I couldn't think of another James Bond line that was appropriate, so let's move on. Kojak must have been busy sucking lollipops down at the grooming salon. The dogs had already been on the scene much earlier when they helped rule out another suspect who had carried out an armed robbery at a different house a few days after the murders. I'm beginning to think that Sugarland sounds like quite a gritty place to live, and I'm not sure what happened to this supposedly low crime rate. Maybe they were putting something in the coffee in 2003. It's like, oh no, it's a really low crime rate. For America! James Bond, Quincy, and Columbo were recalled to the crime scene to see if they could sniff out anything that matched the scent samples from the two fresh suspects. And it turns out that the crime scene was positively sweating with the scent of Chris Brashear. The bloodhounds could smell him on the 9mm Glock handgun, the gun safe, the open drawers. Dude, what have you done? You're so f***ed. And the single black glove found round the back of the house. Is now looking pretty certain that Chris Brashear was the masked shooter who took the lives of Trish and Kevin Whitaker and could have very nearly taken the life of Kent Whitaker if his aim at point-blank range had been a bit sharper. When the suspect was confronted with this new evidence and sat down at the police station, the interview room itself was also suddenly sweating with the scent of Chris Brashear. It seemed obvious he knew the game was up, even though he continued to plead ignorance to the whole thing. You know what I'd be pleading? For a lawyer! Be like, the lawyer. But this left Detective Marshal Slott in a bit of a pickle. It seems unlikely that Chris Brashear had just randomly decided to kill his mate's family. Slott was convinced that the shooting was the execution of broadly the same plan that Bart Whitaker had been hatching for quite some time. But as Brashear wasn't yet giving away anything other than his natural fragrance, it still couldn't be proven that Bart was the architect of the plot. And so Slott struck up a deal with the former accomplice Adam Hipp, which would lead to a sting operation designed to finally penetrate Bart's nectarous web. Why would Adam Hipp do this? Adam Hipp's done nothing wrong. I mean, he plotted a murder, but he doesn't seem to be in trouble. Why would you do this? Why would you be part of a sting? It's not like they can offer you no prosecution. Or are they like, we're going to get you for that planned murder all those years ago? They'd be like, oh, okay, I'll do your stupid sting operation. I imagine that Adam Hipp had been more than a little perturbed about first approaching the police and holding that conversation with Slott in the parking lot. Whilst he may have been keen to clear himself any actual murder charges, he must still have been a bit worried about essentially admitting to the police that he'd agreed to murder 3 people for money. They usually tend to frown upon that kind of behaviour. Yeah, which is why you should just shut the fuck up, Hipp. What's wrong with you? However, Hipp later managed to secure a non-prosecution agreement which served as a guarantee that no action would be taken against him, just so long as he continued to help the detectives with their inquiries, or to put it another way, do absolutely everything that the police demanded of him. And this included phoning his old mate Bart on several occasions to hold conversations which were pre-scripted from Hipp's end by Detective Slott and his team, who would be listening in to every recorded call. I feel like that's a bad idea. Most people are not very good at reading scripts. From Adam Hipp's point of view, he wouldn't have known exactly what happened on the night of the shootings, as he hadn't spoken to Bart for quite some time. So, he begins the discussions by simply expressing his remorse over Bart's loss. Following the lead of the headlines at the time, Bart's suspected involvement hadn't been revealed to the press. But then Hipp claims to Bart that he's feeling quite spooked right now, as he's been informed by the police that they intend to interview him, and he doesn't quite know what to tell them. He feels the horrific events of the night played out frighteningly similar to the plot they had been discussing a couple of years earlier. Hipp now feels scared that he might land himself in serious trouble if he denies any knowledge of the earlier plot and then is found to be lying. He explains to Bart that it might just work out better if he's completely transparent with the police, as he doesn't want to end up getting suspected of murders that he never committed. Bro, the only thing you should be saying is get a lawyer, mate. I can't give you advice on this. You should get a lawyer. You should talk to a professional. Yes. It's quite a cleverly scripted approach, as Hipp never really gives the impression that he's trying to blackmail Bart in any way. He's just letting his old friend know that he might have to be honest about everything when questioned to avoid dropping himself in the real shit and then leaving Bart to work out the next logical move. Oh, I didn't pick up on that he would be blackmailing him. I just thought he was like, I would think he's just concerned for himself if I was Bart receiving that phone call. Bart's response initially seemed quite shrewd, as he never once let slip on the recorded conversations that he understands what Hip is talking about and never once confirms his involvement in any earlier plot. He just seems to change the flow of the conversation whenever Hip goes into specific details. Perhaps Bart suspected straight away that somebody was attempting to lead him into a trap. I mean, it's very obvious. Don't admit to your crimes. Don't admit to your crimes. Simple. No, didn't happen. Nope. Nope. Absolutely not. Nope. You'll have to get up earlier in the morning to trip up a criminal mastermind like Bart Whitaker. Or maybe not, because then Bart goes and drops a big-time bollock. Oh no! Bart advises Hip to tell detectives that he knows nothing about anything. Hip again emphasizes that such dishonesty at the beginning might come back to bite him on the arse further down the line. Bart appears to see his point and makes a proposal to tempt Hip into keeping his mouth shut. He offers to give Hip $20,000 in return for his silence, while still not explicitly confirming that there was anything of significance to tell the police. Bart doesn't actually have that kind of money in his back pocket, but he's willing to send Hip an initial payment of $240 to a post office box in Dallas, and he promised us to send the rest when he could afford it. Well, the other 19,000 and change, dude. You're a little bit short, mate. If Hip had been attempting to broker a genuine deal here, I'm not convinced that he would have agreed to lie to the police for the sake of just $240 and a dubious promise of more money to follow. But of course, this wasn't a genuine deal. The post office box was set up in Adam Hip's name and monitored closely by detectives who felt the sting operation had struck honey when an envelope containing $240 turned up in the mail in April 2004. Of course, Bart's no fool. It's not like he put his real name or address anywhere on the mailer. Instead, he listed the sender as Kay Soze. I kind of like it. Fans of the classic 1995 movie The Usual Suspects might immediately spot the reference here to Kaiser Soze, the mythical Turkish crime lord who turns out to have been Kevin Spacey all along. Dude, spoiler alert! Maybe I should have put a spoiler alert in there, but seriously, I haven't seen The Usual Suspects yet. What are you playing at? Yeah, it's 1995. I think we can... It's 30 years ago. 30 years ago. Yes, I think we can move on. Bart was clearly a big fan of The Usual Suspects and maybe fancied himself as something of a mythical crime lord. His friends claimed that he often quoted one of the film's memorable closing lines from Kaiser Soze. The greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world he didn't exist. But here's something that Kaiser Soze probably wouldn't have done when dishing out hush money. He probably wouldn't have got his own grubby fingerprints all over the mailer containing the $240. What are you doing, dude? You put your fake name on there, but you don't use gloves? What are you up to? The police were still biding their time with Bart Whitaker, though. Whilst he was now stinking of almost as much guilt as Chris Brashear, he had admittedly been quite smart in never explicitly stating in a recorded conversation exactly why he was sending the money to Adam Hip. The detectives would need more than this to secure a conviction. Perhaps they were just taking a little too long about it and were in danger of losing sight of the suspect. On the 28th of June 2004, around 7 months after the murders, Bart Whitaker disappeared. Ooh. Oh, he's on the run. He's leaving. I mean, yeah, you should. His abandoned Chevrolet Yukon was found near an apartment complex in downtown Houston, where he'd recently picked up a job as a waiter. The previous evening, Bart had told his dad that he was just heading out to a club, but he never returned home. Ken may have felt slightly concerned that $10,000 went missing from his own bank account on the very same day that Bart vanished into thin air. Be pretty concerned about $10,000 vanishing from my bank account, even if my son didn't disappear into thin air. Detective Slot was furious and began to blame himself for allowing Bart to slip through their fingers. After an arrest warrant was issued for the missing Thomas Bartlett Whitaker, the detectives patiently tried to explain to Kent that innocent people don't usually tend to run away. Kent still wasn't convinced that his son was guilty of anything. There was bound to be a perfectly rational explanation for why Bart had buggered off into hiding after stealing $10,000 from his father. Well, over a year passed, with no sign of Bart Whitaker and no major developments in the case. Whoa, he's really disappeared. It's kind of impressive. Normally they find people quite quickly. In 2005, Detective Marshall Slot managed to secure authorization to install wiretaps on the cell phones of Chris Brashear and Stephen Champagne, the latter being the other close friend from Bart's time at Huntsville, whom detectives still suspected may have been involved. Brashear was now working in Houston, where Champagne had recently graduated from Marine Intelligence School and was currently training at Base Camp Pendleton on the Southern California coast. I was actually quite surprised that Chris Brashear hadn't already been arrested and charged by this point, bearing in mind that his scent was found all over the crime scene and the murder weapon. But he was still denying any involvement, and apparently the verdict of a trio of trained bloodhounds is not considered to be strong enough evidence to provide a jury without corroborative evidence. Which, I mean, yeah, is kind of fair, because, I don't know, if I'm the lawyer for the dude, be like, they're dogs. I know they smell really well, but they're not infallible. Unlike people, we're perfect. James Bond, Quincy, and Columbo admitted that they were profoundly disappointed by this situation as they licked their own testicles. Meanwhile, the three bloodhounds were unavailable for comment. The hope behind the wiretaps was that either Brashear or Champagne might attempt to call Bart and reveal his location to detectives. Sadly, none of the three suspects made any attempt to call each other during the period when their calls were being monitored, and the wiretaps proved to be a dead end. But before Detective Slot could feel too downhearted about this failure, another major breakthrough came out of the blue at the end of the very same month. Stephen Champagne met up with Slot for a coffee in a Starbucks in Conroe to make a startling fresh confession. Champagne had been a getaway driver on the night of the murders in Sugarland, and he had quite a lot to say for himself. Oh, someone's crossing. It's you, Champagne. It's perhaps a bit surprising that Stephen Champagne chose to sing like a red-legged honey creeper at this point, as unlike Chris Brashear, the police hadn't really pinned anything on him yet. It could be that he was suddenly overcome with guilt or remorse, or maybe he figured out that his phone was being tapped and he was beginning to feel the net closing in. He might have just reasoned that he could strike a deal for immunity from prosecution if he confessed to everything he knew and get back to his promising career as a Marine. But it took him a while to reveal the whole truth. He initially claimed to Detective Slot that he was an unwitting getaway driver who hadn't been informed by either Bart or Brashear that murder was on the menu. He said that he only realized the true extent of what had taken place when he got roped into disposing of some of the evidence in Lake Conroe. But Detective Slot could smell bullshit here without the need to call in Quincy or Columbo. What about James Bond? It didn't help matters that Champagne had then failed a polygraph test whilst he was trying to make out that he was just an innocent driver caught up in the horror. Polygraph tests are such bullshit, though. Slot ended up having to get tough with Stephen Champagne, informing him that there was no chance whatsoever of immunity from prosecution, but it would help his case considerably if he stopped pissing about and provided his full cooperation to detectives. And Champagne eventually agreed to divulge the whole story in a recorded confession with Slot and an FBI special agent. Chris Brashear and Stephen Champagne had agreed to take part in Bart's murder plot in exchange for a massive pile of cash taken from the inheritance that Bart would receive. Champagne was led to believe that Bart's total payout would be in the region of millions of dollars. And here's how it all went down on the night. On the 10th of December 2003, Chris Brashear hovers near the Whitaker family home as he waits for Kent, Trish, and Kevin to leave the house together and keep their appointment with Bart at the Papadu restaurant in honor of Bart's supposed graduation. Once they set off in the Chevrolet Trailblazer, Brashear puts on a black ski mask and lets himself into the house with the key that had been provided by Bart and the code that disabled the alarm. That's already mad suspicious that he's got keys and the code to the alarm. It's already screaming inside job. As instructed, he locates the safe in the crawl space in Kevin's bedroom and breaks open the lock with a chisel. Wait, so it was in a safe? Oh, the gun's in a safe. It's a gun safe, okay. Retrieving the Glock handgun and loading it with the Corbon 9mm Parabellum ammunition that had brought along with him. He then picks up the hidden money in the wardrobe that Bart had instructed him to take, possibly to make it look like a genuine burglary, or possibly because Bart thought the money might come in handy. And he also opens a few dresser drawers in a strangely neat and tidy fashion. Brashear then heads downstairs to the dining room with the loaded gun and awaits the return of the Whitaker family. Down at the Papadu restaurant, Bart really isn't giving off the vibes of someone who knows that his family is going to be shot when the evening is out. He seems perfectly relaxed as he tucks into his seafood, flips the bird for the camera, and graciously accepts a Rolex watch as a graduation gift from his proud parents. Yet Bart is the only one of his family who knows that his friend Stephen Champagne is parked up outside and watching the restaurant. As the Whitaker family take their final photograph together and leave the restaurant, Champagne starts up his car and discreetly follows Kent's Trailblazer back to Sugarland. After they've arrived home, he parks his own car behind the house as three members of the Whitaker family get out of the Trailblazer and walk through the front door and into carnage. In the dining room, Brashear shoots Kevin, Trish, and Kent with the intent of killing them all. He then follows the plan to shoot his own accomplice, Bart, in the arm after a staged scuffle and heads into the kitchen, where he drops the gun and jumps out of the window. At some point, he appears to have somehow lost one of his black gloves before he hops into the backseat of Stephen Champagne's car and is driven away from the crime scene. One of the rules is definitely don't leave behind gloves. It's like surgeons and burglars, don't leave gloves behind. It's one of the rules. Brashear and Champagne stop by at Lake Conroe, where they dump a duffel bag full of evidence into the water and then head off to a bar where they treat themselves to a few drinks to calm their nerves using the money that was stolen from Kent's wardrobe. After enjoying a drink on what they believe to be a dead man's money, I'm hoping that they at least had the good sense not to drive home. It would have been sometime later when they realized that the big payout from Bart was not going to be on the cards, after all, as Kent had inconveniently survived and was not likely to be handing down his entire fortune any day soon. As well as spilling all the grisly details to Detective Marshall Slott, Stephen Champagne also led him to something of even greater value, a whole bag crammed full of physical evidence. There we go. Because all of this is kind of circumstantial, maybe he's lying to get off, maybe blah blah blah, the lawyers would tear it apart. Let's get some hard evidence, shall we? The duffel bag had been dumped into Lake Conroe, and it had obviously gone a bit soggy during the year it had spent immersed in the water, but after a diving team retrieved the bag, there was still plenty of valuable evidence that could be extracted from the grotty, decomposing slush. The haul included a couple of cell phones that the trio had used for planning the operation, and the chisel that had been used to prise open the lock of the gun safe, and which was still covered in the remnants of paint that were a perfect match with the missing flecks of paint from the safe. Guys, what are you doing? You gotta, burn all of this stuff and then dump it in the ocean, not in the lake. You gotta go out onto the ocean and dump it. No one can find it out there. The US government lost a nuclear bomb. A nuclear bomb fell out of a plane off Florida somewhere. It's just in the ocean and they can't find it. If they can't find a nuclear bomb, they're not going to find your bag of shit. The duffel bag also contained the missing black glove that paired with one found at the crime scene, and most crucially of all, a water bottle, the lip of which was smothered in DNA that matched the profile of Chris Brashear. There was no further attempts to squirm out of this one, as Chris Brashear now admitted his guilt alongside Stephen Champagne, and they were both charged with the murders of Trish and Kevin Whitaker. But whilst Brashear and Champagne were now getting busy on cooking up the details with the prosecution, Bart Whitaker was still nowhere to be found and hadn't been spotted for over 15 months. A new hot lead came forward the very next month, in September 2005. A man called Rudy Rios contacted Detective Slott and asked if it was true that a reward was being offered by Crime Stoppers for any information leading to the arrest of Bart Whitaker. Rudy seemed to get quite excited when he was told by Slott that the reward on offer was $10,000. He told Slott that Bart had been hiding out in Mexico for the last 15 months, and Rudy was the only other person in the world who knew the full story. He was the one who helped Bart start a new life in Mexico. Rudy Rios was an affable American man who lived in the tiny village of Cerralvo in Mexico. He worked at a furniture store which belonged to the father of his girlfriend, Cindy Lou. He lived in a nice apartment and was the kind of bloke that seemed to get on with everybody. Wait, but he just helped some dude start a new life? Oh, I guess, okay, so maybe he moved there and he just helps him get set up in the city or something. I thought he sold him a new identity or something. He had apparently had a bit of a rough time as an only child, and would later have a tough time serving in the US military when he was shot and seriously injured during the war in Afghanistan. He was quite lucky to get away with just a bullet wound, as most of the others in his group were killed. But life seemed a little sweeter for Rudy Rios these days, even if he was actually harboring a pretty big secret which he hadn't even divulged to his girlfriend. A secret that had first begun to harvest over in the Lone Star State. What's his secret? Did he really sell new identities? Let's take a closer peek at the war wound from his time in Afghanistan. It's true that Rudy Rios was indeed sporting a pretty noticeable bullet wound in his arm, but this wasn't from his supposed days as a soldier in the US military. Oh, wait, is this... Wait, hang on. Rudy Rios is contacting the crime people, the police, assuming that he knows something about Bart, but he has a wound in his arm, like Bart would have. But then why would Bart phone and, snitch on himself? It's got to be a misdirect or something. But this wasn't from his supposed days as a soldier in the US military. It was from an incident in Sugarland in December 2003, in which his friend had shot him in the arm after shooting his mum, dad, and the younger brother of this only child. Yes, Rudy Rios was otherwise known as Thomas Bartlett Whitaker, more commonly known to his friends and family as Bart. Or at least this version of Rudy Rios was Bart. Just to avoid any confusion, this wasn't the same Rudy Rios who was now on the blower to Detective Slott sniffing around for reward money. What is going on? Whilst Bart may not have been the brightest bulb in the box, I'm sure even he would have thought twice about attempting to claim reward money for grassing on himself. That just wouldn't have been in the style of the mythical crime lord Kaiser Sose. The guy on the phone was the real Rudy Rios, who had briefly worked with Bart in a Houston restaurant and had agreed to help him get set up with a new identity in Mexico for a price. The price was $3,000, which was paid from the $10,000 that Bart stole from his dad's bank account just prior to leaving. When Bart arrived in Mexico with the remaining $7,000, he adopted the identity of Rudy Rios and was looked after for a while by the family of the real Rudy. He later began to forge his own path, hooking up with Cindy Lou, whom he first met in church, getting a job in a furniture store owned by Cindy Lou's family, and settling down in his own apartment. Throughout this period, he entertained his new friends with heroic tales of his adventures and misfortunes in the Afghanistan War, whilst also coming up with sob stories about his troubled childhood. Do you think bro's still wearing a Rolex? He made out that his mother was a sex worker, and while both his parents frequently threw money and gifts at him, they never gave him the two things he really craved: love and attention. It seems as if Bart/Rudy was looking to move on from the furniture store and from the village of Saravo in September 2005 as he decided to attend an interview for a new job in a restaurant in the city of Monterrey, about 60 miles or 100 kilometers away. But this turned out to be one of those nightmare job interviews that I'm sure most of us experienced one time or another. You know how it goes, you arrive on time for the interview, fully prepared and smartly dressed, only to find out that the job doesn't actually exist, and the whole thing was a trap set by the Mexican authorities to ensnare you and hand you over at the US border in the town of Laredo, Texas, where you're arrested on charges of capital murder. Proper annoying. Yeah, I know. I feel like half the job interviews I go to end up with me being arrested by foreign authorities, extradited, and then prosecuted for murder. Half of them, I swear to God. After charging his friend $3,000 for helping him escape to Mexico, the real Rudy Rios had no qualms about helping the police catch him in return for $10,000. Yes, because, I mean, this is the thing. Obviously, you're doing this because you like money. And then they offer more money. In his own blunt words, recorded on the conversation with Detective Slot, if there's a reward, I don't care, I'll turn his ass in. From what I can make out, Rudy Rios did indeed collect the $10,000 reward from Crime Stoppers and faced no consequences for his earlier actions of aiding the escape of a wanted man. Well, he got a very good deal, didn't he? It's good he didn't go to prison, though, because otherwise they'd be like, you're the guy who crossed. Beat the shit out of you in the showers. But don't know why in the showers. It's prison, So, he's now 13 grand up from taking Bart to Mexico and then telling the police that Bart is in Mexico. Not a bad line of work, really. I imagine that Bart was feeling more than a bit miffed about this when he was dragged back across the border and was met by Detective Marshal Slot and Fort Bend County Prosecutor Fred Felkman. Slot felt that Bart had quietly conceded defeat as he was marched into jail and had nothing much to say to anyone. He did have a few rare words of honesty for his dad, though, when Kent was first allowed to talk to his son through a glass partition. According to Kent, his son said, "Dad, I'm just so sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it. It's all my fault." Yeah, no shit, because you arranged the murder of your fucking family, you animal. And it was at this point that Kent Whitaker's spidey senses really began to tingle. Yes, it took him a while to get there. I don't blame him, though. I don't blame him at all. I think it's entirely reasonable that it took him a minute to get there. But Ken finally realized that his son might just be as guilty as Sin. But, as we already know, Kent was the kind of guy who felt that sins were only there to be forgiven. Yeah, he's like, I forgave the murderer when I did think it was my son. Oh, yikes, Kent. Oh, yikes. The lead prosecutor, Fred Felkman, felt slightly differently about the matter, though. He felt that Bart Whitaker was guilty of capital murder and deserved to die. Yeah, because he's not your dad. If all criminals were being prosecuted by their dads, we'd not have a lot of people in prison, would we? Taking inspiration from his accomplices Chris Brashear and Stephen Champagne, one of Bart's first steps was to try and secure a plea deal with the prosecution team. No, dude, but you're the one that they really want. You're the mastermind. He was naturally quite aggrieved that Fred Felkman was pursuing the death penalty, and so he offered to provide a written proffer, a statement of admitting guilt, in exchange for an agreement with the prosecution team that they would chill out a bit and seek a life sentence instead of a death sentence. Which sound like the opposite things, but you're dying in prison either way. Or maybe not with a life sentence, you get parole, right? But this is life without parole. If they're considering a death sentence, you're going to negotiate down to life without parole, I feel. Bart's lawyer drafted the proffer and submitted it to Felkman, who swiftly rejected it on the grounds there was no hint of remorse within the coldly calculated and manipulative statement. The prosecution made it clear that they were not going to entertain the idea of a plea deal, a move which infuriated Bart to the point where he subsequently refused to enter a plea for capital murder at all, forcing the court to enter a not guilty plea on his behalf. More coldly calculated thinking may also have been behind this move, though. Bart knew that the evidence against him was strong, and he had practically no chance of getting away with this, but he still wanted to hedge his bets and wasn't prepared to enter a guilty plea. However, by also refusing to vocally declare that he was not guilty, he was less likely to be viewed as a lying and untrustworthy little turd whenever a new piece of evidence was presented to the court and blatantly demonstrated guilt. The jury got to hear for themselves the extent of Bart's frustration when a recording of a telephone conversation between a jailed Bart and his dad was later played in the courtroom during the trial. Is that phrase I loved? Never write something down that you wouldn't want to be read back to you in open court in a condescending tone. Never speak on the prison phones. Anything that you wouldn't want to be played back to you in open court. Bart can be heard whinging to his dad about how unfair it is that his plea deal was rejected and how his lawyers seemed a bit useless. He also makes the suggestion that maybe it's time to bring out the big guns, an indication that perhaps his dad should be splashing out more money on his defense. In this scenario, it's really beggars belief. I mean, yeah, it's pretty wild, isn't it? It's like, Dad, I know I murdered our family, but you're rich. Can we get some good-ass lawyers or what, so I can get away with it and get back to my life after murdering our family? F you, Bart, you piece of shit. You've got a spoiled brat talking to his dad, who he tried to have killed, and whose wife and 19-year-old son he had murdered, and he's moaning to him that there's not enough money being spent on top-shelf lawyers. Maybe Kent might have had more money to throw at lawyers if Bart had insisted on stealing it all at every opportunity. Still, maybe Bart did have some humane qualities buried somewhere deep beneath that cold exterior. A few months before the trial got underway in March 2007, he took the time to send a Christmas card to lead prosecutor Fred Felkman. The exact wording of the personal greeting inside the card were never made public, but it apparently included a recommendation from Bart that Felkman should keep his family firmly in mind during the holiday season, which was a really sweet gesture. Well, yes, such advice would have been hard for anyone to take seriously, coming from a man who had his own family murdered. And I think it's fairly obvious that sending a message like this to his prosecutor shortly before his murder trial was intended to be a not particularly well-veiled threat. That's a bad idea, dude. You think they haven't been through this before? They're prosecutors. They've dealt with scarier people than you child. But not a child in the actual sense of being a child, but as an adult who can fully face the death penalty. Yes! Not that Fred Felkman gave a shit. He was as tough as a desert cactus. In fact, he brought the matter up during trial. Of course, it was difficult to prove that it was anything other than a genuine Christmas greeting, as Bart unconvincingly insisted in court, but it perhaps did help to illustrate how Bart thought of himself as some kind of movie gangster who could intimidate one of the most experienced and grisly prosecutors in Texas. Yeah, like I say, that he's dealt with scarier pricks than you. Plenty of fresh revelations came bubbling to the surface during the 6-day trial of Thomas Bartlett Whitaker, held at the 400th Judicial District Court in Fort Bend County. You may remember that whilst Adam Hipp was the first to come forward to the police with details of an earlier murder plot in 2001, it was another accomplice in that same plot, Justin Peters, who first revealed that Bart had been scheming long before that. And now Justin Peters was in court alongside a guy called Will Anthony to provide details of an earlier plot from December 2000, which came closer to fruition than most. Justin Peters and Will Anthony were Bart's friends from university who became embroiled in a scheme to murder the Whitaker family, which again bore similarities to the plot that was ultimately carried out, although this one seemed a bit rougher around the edges. Holy shit, he wanted to kill his family 3 times? Bart, you're such a piece of shit, I hope you get the needle in the arm. And it's 2000 and something. If they do send him to death, he could be dead by now, which is a nice thought. Peters and Anthony would enter the Whitaker home, whilst Bart and the rest of the family were enjoying a restaurant meal, but the duo weren't given a key or the alarm codes. They were expected to just climb in through the back window, and this would prove to be a big problem. That seems like a way better plan. Like, just accidentally leaving a window open is way more believable as an excuse than, oh no, they got the keys and the alarm code. The plan actually went ahead to a certain extent, as Bart took the family away to a restaurant, whilst Peters and Anthony approached the Whitaker family's home. Anthony was armed with a gun, with which he intended to kill Kent, Trish, and Kevin when they got back home. However, as Anthony attempted to climb in through the back window, he triggered an alarm which prompted the panicked duo to scarper from the scene. Alright, because there's going to be motion sensors inside. Maybe just like forgetting to turn off the alarm could be a thing, but to turn on the alarm when you leave the house. But the key thing would still be super suspicious. Bart may have been disappointed when he returned home from the restaurant to find that nobody was shooting up his family, but he probably chalked this up to experience and brewed up a few adjustments for future plans, of which there were many. In fact, it's not surprising that Bart was doing so badly at university, as he appeared to be devoting most of his time between 2001 and 2003 to figuring out the best way to kill his parents and brother. What a piece of shit. Adam Hipp told the jury about a remarkably different plan, which was brewed in 2001 and involved a proposed family holiday down a lake house owned by Bart's grandmother. How many lake houses does this family have? The plan involved burning the lake house down to the ground and killing Kent, Trish, and Kevin, but Bart himself would emerge triumphantly from the blaze with nothing more than a few scorch marks to suggest that he also came close to being burnt alive, but somehow managed to escape at the last minute. This plan never went beyond discussion, possibly because it was a bit over the top, but it's notable for being the first scheme in which Bart himself would take a bit of a battering to deflect any suspicion, an idea which would be reworked into future models. Another separate scheme from 2001 involving Justin Peters harked back to the original blueprint of a shooting at the family home and was only abandoned because Bart's friend from university, Jennifer Jaffert, got wind of the plan. Oh my god, how many people know about your plans to murder your family, Bart, you idiot? Jennifer was so disturbed, in fact, that she reported the matter to the police, as you should. And here's something else to make the head spin. The police approached Kent and Trish Whitaker to inform them of the plot, but Kent and Trish just laughed it off and put it all down to the kind of comical misunderstanding that you might find in a badly written sitcom. Yeah, I mean, you would because he's your kid. Oof. So, not only had Kent spent the best part of a couple of years refusing to believe that his son had been responsible, this was after he had been forewarned with the details of a strikingly similar plot a couple of years before the actual murders, and he still wasn't putting two and two together. I mean, I could understand why any parent might find themselves in denial over such a horrifying thought, but at this point it feels like Kent was just sticking his fingers in his ears and refusing to acknowledge anything that was presented to him. Again, I can't blame Kent for this. I don't have blame for Kent. Kent's a victim, and to believe that your son could possibly do something that is this horrific is like, I mean, goddamn. I put my fingers in my ears, Jesus. Adam Hipp talked in detail about the later plan from 2001, which he had first told the police about 5 days after the murders, and he was questioned by the prosecution team over the mindset of Bart and why Hipp had agreed to participate. Hipp admitted that he wasn't proud of his involvement in court. No, I'm pretty proud of it. It was a good plan, Your Honor. No, it was a good plan. Yeah, I mean, I didn't do it, but I would have. But he was curious to see how far Bart would take it. We should probably bear in mind that unlike the predecessor, Will Anthony, who had dropped out of the plan by this stage, Adam Hipp never reached a point where he arrived at the Whitaker home armed with a gun. Hipp made reference to Bart's obsession with the character of Kaiser Sose from The Usual Suspects and felt that Bart identified with him in some way and admired the manner in which the fictional character got away with everything. Hipp told the court, "I think there was a disconnect between reality and fiction, and he really thought he could be like Kaiser Sose." Adam Hipp also claimed that he'd become so frightened of Bart and what he might do next that he kept a note under his bed containing full details of the plan, just so that Bart would be dropped in the if something happened to either Hipp or his family. Smart. That's a good one. Although you should probably let Bart know that you've got that dead man switch. Prosecutor Fred Felkman pointed out to the jury that there were clear patterns in the lifestyles of the students that Bart signed up for his cause. For starters, they were all relatively clean-cut kids with pretty well-off parents, and it wouldn't usually be the first students to get picked out of the class as potential future murderers. Come on, we've all seen American Psycho. We all know that's exactly where murderers come from. God damn, this zero sugar Fanta is absurd. I don't know if you want to leave that in, editor, but god damn is it good. The original recruit, Will Anthony, had described himself as an isolated and introverted nerd at university who was grateful to share a bond with a new friend like Bart. Adam Hipp had been struggling with his studies and was eventually thrown off the course. Justin Peters had been going through a fairly deep traumatic time after losing his girlfriend in a road traffic accident. Oh man, that sucks to have something like that happen to you when you're so young. It seemed as if Bart was purposefully targeting students who were either suffering from low self-esteem or struggling to deal with turmoil or even immense grief, as these were the kinds of people whose current vulnerabilities could be easily exploited. Bro, Bart is turning out to be a fucking psycho, dude. Like, he's just preying on people in the most prey way? In the most predatory way possible. God damn. When Stephen Champagne took his turn to give testimony, he revealed how the idea of murdering the Whitaker family had first been presented to him by Bart as kind of a joke, possibly to test the waters, and check that Champagne wasn't the kind of person who'd go running to the police at the first opportunity. That's also, I think Bart, he's an absolute piece of shit psychopath. I mean, assuming he did this allegedly for now. But I don't think he's stupid. I think he's pretty intelligent. This kind of manipulation's pretty clever stuff. Oh, yeah, no, I'd consider killing my family. Right? I mean, right? Champagne was later asked to take on the role of shooter, but he told the jury that he wasn't mad keen on that idea. He eventually agreed to be the getaway driver after Bart persuaded his new housemate Chris Brashear to hold the gun. Brashear himself wasn't in attendance in the courtroom, and he would be facing his own trial later in the year. Mr. Champagne did have another chilling disclosure to pour into the mix, though. He alleged that Bart invited him out for dinner in February 2004 for a friendly catch-up, around 3 months after the murders. Bart was keen to know exactly what Champagne had told the detectives, which at this point wasn't very much at all, as this was long before Champagne's full confession. Champagne now alleged that Bart told him that the job wasn't finished, and he began to discuss ways in which Kent could be polished off for good. Oh my lord. He's like, no, guys, a shame. Only me and my dad survived, right? Yeah, what if someone popped him off? Right? Psycho, dude, psycho. Bart denied that such a meeting ever took place, but if true, it meant he was still utterly determined to murder the father under whose roof he was now living, even though he was aware that detectives were already deeply suspicious of his own involvement following the allegations made by Adam Hipp. And it makes you wonder what exactly was going through his head. An obvious point brought to the table was that Bart Whitaker was just completely off his rocker, or to put it in a polite manner, he was suffering from some kind of mental disorder, which would have partly explained his decision-making. Remember that, kids? We did an episode on him. The guy, got drunk, got in a car and killed a bunch of people. And he was like, his lawyer's defense for him was he's got affluenza, where he's so rich that he doesn't understand the consequences of his actions, which is insane. But I think it actually worked. This is Bart's defense. It's like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm too affluent to understand consequences. My parents are too rich. I'm too much of a Nepo baby. One witness called to the stand was Dr. Brendan O'Rourke, whose services had been requested by Bart's parents back in 1997 following the string of burglaries, including the theft of computers from Clements High School. Dr. O'Rourke didn't feel too concerned about Bart's mental health and felt that the juvenile justice system would soon have the troublesome kid sorted out. In the meantime, he seemed perfectly fit to return to school. Uh-oh. I don't blame him, but it's like, you turned out to be wrong. Because I don't know, you'd be like, he just stole some shit. It's like, okay, well, send him off to the naughty boy school, and they'll teach him some proper discipline. What's that? What was the guy's name in Malcolm in the Middle? Was it Francis, the older kid who gets sent off to military school? And he turns out all right? I'm like, yeah, look, military school. Excellent. I'll be kind of down to send my kids to military school, even if they're good. I just think the military can be really good for, instilling discipline. 5 years later, in 2002, the psychologist Lynn Ayers conducted sessions with Bart which were intended to identify any learning disabilities, such as attention deficit disorder. What exactly prompted this is not entirely clear, as Bart was supposed to be doing well at Sam Houston State University at this stage, to the best of the family's knowledge. Oh my god, I just unlocked a memory. I remember when I was a kid. I can't remember what I was. I was something 13 or 14, around then, and I wasn't doing very well in school, and my parents took me to see if I had a learning disability. And I mean, the good news was that I didn't. The bad news was it turned out that I just didn't give a shit. The report came back. I remember finding this letter. My parents moved house a few years ago, and I just found this letter because my parents keep everything. You could find my school reports from when I'm 6. And this letter was no, it turns out Simon's quite intelligent. He just doesn't care. And I think a couple of years later, I actually started caring, and I started doing better in school, which was nice. I just remember being taken to this person to test me to see if I was all right. I suppose it's entirely possible that the sessions may have been triggered by the university staff who were trying to figure out why this bright young man was hell-bent on making a mess of everything. Whatever the reason, Lynn Ayers concluded that Bart showed signs of something more disturbing than a learning disability. She became particularly worried when Bart solemnly told her that he considered social relationships to be pointless. Lynn told the court that in her opinion, Bart had an Atlas complex, a reference to Titan from Greek mythology, who was condemned to bear the weight of the heavens on his shoulders. Wait, okay, I mean, to me it's more it just seems a bit sociopathic. He's not he's got the weight of the world on his shoulders. How? He's just a Nepo baby. This feels like quite a miserable comparison, but Lynn suggested that Bart was happy to accept the challenge of holding the world on his own shoulders, and he felt he could do it better than any of the other typically moronic and annoying human beings whose presence plagued his life. Oh my god, Bart, preach. Other humans, they're all so fucking stupid, right, Bart? However, this line of thought was never pursued. I just feel like, okay, he's got Atlas complex. He just sounds like a sociopathic narcissist. I'm not an expert, am I? But, I mean, Jesus. However, this line of thought was never pursued, and no official medical diagnosis was presented in court to explain Bart's behavior or motive. The prosecution team repeatedly pushed forward the idea that the sole reason behind Bart's obsession with murdering his own family was that he was a greedy little shitbag motivated entirely by the desire to take every cent of his mum and dad's hard-earned wealth. Despite the fact that he was frequently gifted luxury cars, watches, and houses, this wasn't enough for Bart, who wanted everything. I mean, yeah, it makes sense, because I don't think he really feels emotions properly. And he's like, oh, look, there's these two people who are standing in the way of me having money to buy shit. They just happen to be my family. But, who cares? It'd be better if they were dead, right? Right? There was an almost comical scene that played out in the courtroom when Bart discovered that it actually had access to a trust fund set up by his grandparents to the tune of $80,000 the whole time, but nobody had bothered to tell him about it. That is some such rich people. It's like, oh no, your grandparents left you in trust $80,000. And his parents just forgot. Oh yeah, I think you do. It's in some bank account somewhere. I guess. It's possible that Bart would have been in such a rush to kill his parents if he'd been made aware that he had $80,000 to play with, although I suspect that at best might have just delayed his plans very slightly. Oh yeah, fully agree. That's not going to change who he is. He's still going to be an absolute piece of shit, in my opinion. I can't imagine it would have taken that long for him to burn through the trust fund and then eye up the bigger prize of $1.5 million, which is it's really a lowball figure, I promise. Unless they are living to the absolute hilt. You're not buying your kid a Rolex if you're worth 1.5 million quid. You're just not. Like $1.5 million dollars, sorry. Is that okay? So you own a house, bro. I mean, okay, that's a bit much, but I don't know. It's more than that. He's eyeing more than that for sure, which was a figure referenced several times throughout the trial. Also, I mean, if he's got 1.5 million estate, what's inheritance tax in America like? I don't know. In the UK, they're going to cut you in half, so you'll be left with 750. Which is even less money. Bart denied that the murders had anything to do with money when he took the stand towards the end of the trial to be cross-examined by Fred Felkman. I just didn't like him very much. During the cross-examination, Bart thankfully resisted the urge to wish the prosecutor and his family a happy St. Patrick's Day. By this stage, it appears that Bart had given up any last remaining glimmer of hope that he might be declared innocent, and was now making a last desperate attempt to convince the jury that he didn't deserve the death penalty. We got a hint of how Bart may have finally decided to accept a bit of responsibility. By the way, he admitted to the court, I am 100% guilty for this. I put the plan in motion. If I had not done so, it would not have happened. What is his lawyer just like, oh, Jesus Christ. Didn't you plead not guilty and now you're in what? He expressed remorse for the victims, his father, and indeed anyone who had... Why? I don't understand. Surely this would happen after you've been found guilty, because sentencing is later. So you'd be like, please don't give me the death penalty. I know I'm guilty. Or is he just like, oh God, they're going to find me guilty. Yeah, look, I did it. Please don't give me the death penalty. Please. I know I'm a bad boy, but please. He expressed remorse for his victims, his father, and indeed anyone who had ever been unfortunate enough to come into contact with him during his life. I feel like just hearing about him, I feel like he also needs to apologize to me and everyone else who's listened to this episode, because now we're aware of what a horrible, horrible person exists in this world. He struggled to come up with a precise explanation for what had driven him to take such actions, but noted that he often struggled to meet their high expectations and felt their love was conditional on a standard that could never be reached. Fred Felkman described... What? Bro, they clearly really liked you. Even if it's just through their expressing it in a weird way of just buying your shit. But if they didn't like you and didn't think you were doing well in their eyes, which I guess was a bit of a lie, because you lied to them... They still liked you, bro. They brought you a Rolex and a series of luxury. They bought you a lake house. What is happening? Fred Felkman described this as crap and noted how Bart's parents had constantly shown him nothing but unconditional love. The defense team, led by Randy McDonald, never really put up much of an argument and called no witnesses. It was felt as if Randy's focus from the beginning was entirely on conceding defeat and attempting to convince the jury that Bart's life should be spared. This is happening in Texas, right? Texas is definitely yeehaw. They've got the death penalty. With this in mind, it does seem bizarre that Bart didn't just enter a guilty plea. Whilst I wondered earlier if there were any shrewd legal maneuvering at work here, that doesn't seem to be the case at all. Randy gave the impression throughout the trial that it was blindingly obvious his client was guilty and that all that was missing was the plea. Maybe tight-fisted Ken really should have dug deeper into his broad pockets and brought out the big guns. Randy did address the question in court over why on earth they didn't just put in a guilty plea from the start, and he said, "We have offered to plead guilty. That offer was never withdrawn. It's open right now throughout the trial." Wait, what? This was another bitter swipe at the prosecution team for refusing to entertain any notion of a plea deal, but it was now sounding a bit desperate. Oh, okay. Wait. Oh, okay. So you can plead guilty, but you can get a plea deal ahead of time. Oh, we don't have that in the UK. That makes more sense. Okay, I'm seeing that. Okay. It kind of felt as if the defense team was saying, yes, it's embarrassingly obvious that my client is guilty, but we couldn't have entered a guilty plea without a deal because then my client would just get executed, and that's hardly sporting, is it? After the closing arguments from prosecution and defense teams, well, more of a resigned shrug in the case of the latter, the jury retired to consider their verdicts. This is what's going to take about 3 minutes. He said he's guilty. As is the way in Texan law for capital cases, the juries determined both guilt and punishment over 2 separate phases of deliberations. Oh, that's so intense. Oh my God, I couldn't be on a jury like that. Oh, I could. If someone was really bad, I'd vote for their death. I'm like, I couldn't do that. Like, no, I'm pretty sure I could, actually. Although, you know, I don't think I'd give him the death penalty. I think I'd just give him life without parole. He's young. I'd give him like 25 years, no parole, and then potential for parole after 25 years, just because he's young. And I don't know, maybe he's a psychopath, so he needs to be locked up for people's safety, but the parole board can assess that after 25 years. I don't think he deserves to die. I know he's a piece of shit, but he's not tortured anyone to death. He's young, he's stupid. I don't think he deserves to die. I really don't. There wasn't a lot of hanging about during the guilt phase on March the 5th, 2007. It took around 90 minutes for the jury to reach a unanimous verdict that Bart was guilty of capital murder. Why did it take 90 minutes? Did they just want a little bit of a break? A little bit of a chill out to play around on their phones? It would be another couple of days before the punishment phase kicked in, during which time arguments could be presented to the court over whether Bart should be saved from the death penalty. Bart himself again took to the stand to declare that he was a different person now, and the only people he ever hated were his family, although he now regarded his father as his best friend and felt that Kent would only be victimized further if Bart was put to death. I'd like to hear from Kent on this one, to be honest. I think, even though he's his father, I think that's quite an important thing, because he is one of the victims of this, the main victim. The main surviving victim. Bart claimed that he had rediscovered... I would not go for this angle. I'd be like, yeah, I'm a piece of shit. But I'm also like, what is he, like 20? I'd be like, I'm a kind of a piece of shit. Weren't you sometimes a piece of shit when you were 20, Jerry? You just need one person to be like, I was kind of a piece of shit. And then just be like, well, in 25 years, I'll be like a fully fledged adult. How about we see how that works out? Right? Bart claimed that he had rediscovered God while hanging around in Mexico and regularly participated in Bible studies held in jail. He was also very sorry for everything that had happened, a point which might have helped his cause if he'd mentioned it earlier in his proffer originally submitted to the prosecution team. Fred Felkman wasn't at all convinced by this last-minute display of remorse, prompting Bart to ask him, "You believe a person can't be sorry for things he did?" Felkman's response was, "No, I think they can be sorry, Mr. Whitaker, but I don't think you are. I think you're sorry you got caught, and now you're figuring out how to get out of the death penalty." By far Bart's biggest supporter, well, there weren't that many to choose from, was his father Kent. During his impassioned plea to the jury to save his son's life, Kent did spend a bit of time waffling on about how God has the power to provide genuine forgiveness and heal hearts. But this may not have been particularly relevant, as God wasn't present in the courtroom to confirm or deny this. But Kent explained how his faith had helped him forgive the people responsible for the murder of his wife and son, not just Bart, but the getaway driver Stephen Champagne and the shooter Chris Brashear. He appeared to take some responsibility for Bart's behavior, explaining that his son had been spoiled and that too much pressure had been placed upon him to succeed, pressure that ultimately sent him over the edge. Kent now saw no logic in the jury choosing the death sentence, as in doing so, they would be ordering the death of the last surviving member of his family, and only amplifying Kent's own heartache and grief by composing a gut-wrenching final chapter devoid of hope. He also promised the jury that neither Trish nor Kevin would have wanted to see Bart put to death, and claimed that Trish would have been appalled that the state had chosen to pursue the death penalty. He killed her. Kent wasn't entirely alone in arguing for leniency. Trish Whitaker's brother, Beau Bartlett, also pleaded with the jury to save the life of the man who had murdered his sister. However, the jury were not persuaded by the arguments. Oh, dude, really? The punishment phase consisted of 12 hours of deliberations held over 2 days before the verdict was declared on the 8th of March 2007. 27-year-old Thomas Bartlett Whitaker was sentenced to death. Oh, wow. Okay, when did the crimes occur? Because he's 27 now. They were a few years before, right? Okay, so he's a little bit older than I remember, but that's heavy, dude. I can't help feeling that the death sentence was unduly harsh, particularly when compared to the other two conspirators in the murder plot. I'm not suggesting that Bart should have been let off with a couple of hundred hours of community service, like he probably would have done if he'd lived in Scotland. Fucking true, Danny. Scotland and their idea of what is an appropriate prison sentence. But let's take a look at the punishments that were dished out to Stephen Champagne and Chris Brashear. The getaway driver, Stephen Champagne, had offered his full cooperation to the investigation and made a deal with the prosecutors in which he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder rather than capital murder and received a sentence of 15 years in prison. Wow. Oh, he's the getaway driver. Okay, sure. He didn't serve the full sentence and is now a free man. The shooter, I feel fine, I guess, about that. Like, he was like, no, I'm not going to kill anyone. I guess I'll be the getaway driver. He was a vulnerable person in a vulnerable position, and I think 15 years is... Oh, wait, he got out already? 15 years seems about right, I feel. The shooter, Chris Brashear, eventually offered his own cooperation with detectives and made a plea deal in which he pled guilty to first-degree murder, again downgraded from capital murder, which would have carried the death penalty, and received a prison sentence of 30 years with the possibility of parole. That's probably what I would have liked to see Bart get. And I think Chris deserves this because he actually pulled the trigger and murdered 2 people. Ken turned up to the trial to read out a witness impact statement in which he told Brashear that he forgave him. Counting from the time he was first arrested, Brashear could in theory be eligible for parole in 2035. Incidentally, all the collaborators involved in the earlier plots were given immunity from prosecution in return for their cooperation, including Will Anthony, who turned up to the Whitaker home armed with a gun. We never know how that might have ended if it had not been frightened off by a security alarm. But the main point is that Chris Brashear was the one who fired the bullets into 3 victims who were just returning home from a family meal, killing 2 of them and coming close to killing the 3rd. Bart Whitaker was the one who suggested that they do this. It's true that Bart was convicted under the Texas law of parties provision, which states that a person can be criminally responsible for the actions of others if that person acts with intent to promote or assist the commission of an offense. A criminal found guilty under the law of parties isn't usually in line for a death sentence, except in relatively rare circumstances, such as when the sentencing jury finds beyond reasonable doubt that the individual caused the death of the victims. I mean, that's definitely true in this case, which I guess is why the death sentence was possible. But it does seem harsh. This was one of those relatively rare cases. But whilst the shooter is now in prison with the possibility of release in about a decade, Bart was sentenced to death and denied even a life sentence in prison with no parole. So was that entirely fair? The prosecution team argued that it absolutely was fair, and that neither Brashear nor Champagne would have engaged in violent crime had they not been influenced by the manipulative Bart Whitaker. Well, I agree with that, yeah. Felk Fredman felt that Bart met the criteria for the death penalty in Texas, as he was a continuing threat to the public and there had been no mitigating circumstances. We'd just lock him up forever. As Felkman put it, he was the ringleader. He literally led his family back to be assassinated. Yeah, but I don't think anyone's arguing with you, Felkman, that he's a massive piece of shit and deserves to go to prison possibly for the rest of his life. We're just arguing about whether someone who committed a crime in their early 20s, mid-20s, should be sentenced to death for something like this. It's likely that things may have turned out differently if Bart had been allowed to pursue the plea deal that was granted to the other two conspirators but swiftly rejected by the prosecution in Bart's case. Admittedly, he hadn't exactly helped matters by buggering off to Mexico for a while, whilst Brashear and Champagne were already cooperating with the investigation and leading detectives to the dumped evidence. And it seems that Bart was light on remorse after he was arrested, as he was far more interested in cold legal maneuvering to save his own neck. Because he's a psychopath, in my opinion. But had he been allowed to pursue a plea deal like the others and made a bit more effort to shed a few tears, he may not have found himself in a position where he was the only one of the group to be found guilty of capital murder despite never getting his own hands dirty, whilst the other man who pulled the trigger several times was found guilty of a lower degree offence. It will come as no surprise to hear that Bart himself thought that this was all a bit wonky, and he wasn't entirely happy with how the trial had been conducted. He's like, got the death penalty. He's like, no, it all went swimmingly. But you got the death penalty. Oh, yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I suppose I did. He appealed against his death sentence, pointing out 9 perceived points of error in the courtroom, including the prosecution's references to the plea deal negotiations, which he reckoned was prosecutorial misconduct, as such discourse was not usually admissible under Texan law. He also complained that certain recorded conversations between himself and the stingster Adam Hipp should have been edited before they were played in court, as they contained examples of hearsay, along with details of other unrelated offences such as computer thefts and matters which could prejudice the jury against him. While he was at it, he also objected to the actual manner of execution, as he found the administration of lethal injection to be a cruel and unusual punishment which violated the Eighth Amendment. Yeah, I would not be down for lethal injection. I think I'd rather... I don't know, firing squad probably, but really I'd like to go in one of those nitrogen chambers that they use to euthanize people. That would be good. Why can't we just use the nitrogen chamber to execute people? There's so much that seems to go wrong with that lethal injection, and you don't really know what it's like because they're unconscious. I don't know. Not a fan. In 2009, the State Appeals Court rejected all 9 of Bart's legal arguments, and found that there had been no violation of due process or federal law at any point during the trial. Of course, if all this had taken place during the good old days, then Bart wouldn't have had much time to fanny about like this. Back in the 1960s, a prisoner sentenced to death in the US only had to wait between a few months and a couple of years to be executed. Holy shit. That's some third world shit right there. You know, where it's like, oh yeah, you're guilty. All right, take him out back. If you delve much further back in history, the prisoner would usually be swinging from a rope before the jury had time to think about what they might be having for dinner. It's so crazy. Things began to slow to a crawl following the 6-year suspension of the death penalty between 1968 and 1976. When executing people came back into fashion in 1977, it came packaged with new layers of complexity for a number of really good reasons, including safeguarding against wrongful convictions and allowing time for the condemned to spend years battling through the ridiculously long-winded appeals process in court. I don't know if it's ridiculously long-winded. I think if the state is choosing to take someone's life, the appeals process should be ridiculously long-winded, because it's about as big a decision as you can make. It also means the prisoners get to spend the last few decades of their lives on death row, where they're usually banged up in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. Bart kept himself busy after he was sent to the Allen B. Polunsky unit in West Livingston, Texas, to await his execution. Who would want a unit in a prison named after themselves? I get, like, if you give a bunch of money, they'll name a wing of a hospital after you, or a school building or something. But you'd be like, no, I gave money to the prison, or I was the warden of the prison, and they named a bit of the prison after me. I'd be like, no, thank you, appreciate the offer, but I'm good. Especially like the death row. Jesus. Well, he had distanced himself from the name Bart by that point and wanted to be known only as Thomas, declaring, "Those of you who knew me as Bart, sorry, Bart is dead. Good riddance. I never much liked that son of a bitch anyways." I think it's only fair that we respect his wishes. So anyway, Bart reportedly earned an undergraduate degree in English and Sociology from Adams State University and followed it up with a master's degree in Humanities from California State University. He claims that he didn't originally get much help in this department from the wardens, who didn't feel inclined to offer any help in educating a walking corpse. And I suppose, even if you're locked up for 23 hours a day, I'd do something like this for sure. I don't know, even if I'm going to be executed, I'd just get really good at something. Like, otherwise you're just going to go insane. And I suppose it could be said that there wasn't going to be an awful lot he could actually do with a master's degree, although it could be said that it's not like he had anything else to do while spending 23 hours a day in isolation, so why not? I mean, learning sometimes just nice for the pointlessness of learning stuff. Like, I like learning things I'm never going to use and read interesting books that are not particularly valuable in any way. Like, to me personally, it's just interesting to learn. An ink blob of controversy arose when it was discovered that Bart's thesis for his master's degree had somehow become available to purchase as a paperback book on Amazon under the catchy title Who Fears Hell Runs Toward It, on the Christian metaphysical foundations of the American penitentiary and the missing image of resistance in Foucault's Discipline and Punish. Okay. Can you profit from something you wrote in prison? I think there's a rule against that or something, right? Or you can't profit off your crimes. So if this is exploiting or using information that he has because he's a criminal, then I guess he can't, but I guess maybe we'll find out. Andy Kahn, the director of victim services and advocacy at Crime Stoppers, vented his strong disapproval over this, pondering over how an inmate had managed to start flogging books on Amazon and pointing out that US prisoners shouldn't be engaging in unauthorized business activities or making profits from their works. I gotta ask, why not? I don't understand why that's a problem. It sounds like he's... Look, I get that he's a criminal and all that shit, but why is this bad? I mean, he's going to earn that money, get him paying his taxes, get him put into a bank account that he can have some money put into his commissary or put it in a trust or whatever so that he can access it when he gets out of prison. Oh, he's never getting out of prison, is he? Or like, I don't know, it doesn't seem like that much of a problem, does it? I definitely have a problem with people profiting off their crimes, but if you're in prison and you write a book, you know, John's Adventures in Fairyland, then who gives a shit? The latter point is debatable, as the thesis doesn't appear to directly refer to the Whitaker murders, so it's not as if he was in violation of the Son of Sam law, which prevents criminals from taking financial advantage of publicity relating to their crimes. It was never proven that Bart had anything to do with the book going on sale, and not much action appears to have been taken anyway, as the book is still available to buy today. Read it at your own peril, though the Amazon reviews are mixed and include the following insightful critiques. A purely academic work which will probably be seen as unreadable and incomprehensible by the poorly educated. Another one read, the worst book I've ever read. Well, that's because you're an uneducated idiot, isn't it? And perhaps the most off-putting review of all, the title makes more sense than the book. Bart still wasn't done with his education, and he reportedly followed all of this up by embarking on a master's degree in English literature, but there was likely to be a minor issue with that one, as it wasn't due to be completed until after his execution date. He also turned his hand to creative writing. With the help of volunteers on the outside, Bart set up a blog called Minutes Before 6, the title referring to the time, 6 p.m., at which executions get underway on death row. Originally conceived as an outlet for his own scribblings, Minutes Before 6 evolved into a platform for all US inmates to express themselves via the publishing of articles, poetry, and art, and it's now considered one of the biggest collections of prison writing in the world. I hate this dude. I think he's an absolute douchebag, but that is a really good... Like, anything that gets prisoners working on something constructive, rather than just staring at a wall for 23 hours a day, I am down for. Like, prison should be punishment, but, like, this is reform. This isn't like, they're not writing like explicit texts of the crimes they committed. I assume not. I don't think that would be okay. Bart made extensive contributions to the blog in forms of articles and fiction, going on to scoop several awards in different categories from the PEN America's Prison and Justice Writing Program. He's actually built up a gang of devoted followers of his work who believe that his writing is an important exploration of growth, self-awareness, guilt, redemption, and transformation. Some of his biggest supporters have even suggested that executing such an incredible talent would be a crime in itself. I'll tell you what, it's not. Not everyone's a fan, though. Other critics have dismissed his work as pretentious and disingenuous waffle, which is just another calculated attempt to manipulate and deceive. I think that is correct. One particular criticism repeatedly leveled at his work is that he spends a lot of time insisting that he doesn't intend to bang on about the misery of his situation, but then proceeds to go on an extended whinge about the misery of his situation. And in fact, Bart spent much of his 11 years on death row complaining about the standards of customer service. He was particularly vocal about the near all-day isolation, but he also took frequent swipes at the poor medical care, the lack of televisions and telephones, and, flashing disco mirror balls or something, as well as the rubbish food. When he wasn't busy studying for degrees, writing, complaining, and allegedly setting up a publishing empire, Bart spent the rest of his time attempting to sue the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, along with a long list of other named parties, over the use of the phenobarbital drug in executions, right? It's one of the cocktail of the three, right? Yeah, I think he's kind of right about this, to be honest. This was a joint lawsuit filed with 2 other death row inmates, which challenged the purity of the pentobarbital drug that would kill them. The state had resorted to using compounded versions of the drug. This is because I remember this in the news, where the drug company that made this was like, no, we're not making this anymore because you just use it for executions. I think it was a European company even. Forcing the state to seek alternatives from a compounding pharmacy, which is where they make custom drugs. The lawsuit alleged that the compounded version had not been adequately tested and could cause unconstitutional pain and suffering for the condemned. Yeah, I do agree. I wouldn't want the lethal injection. The lawsuit kept bouncing around for years, but the claims were repeatedly rejected by the courts, and it never got anywhere. In the case of Bart and one of his co-plaintiffs, the lawsuit was deemed to be a hypothetical, as neither of them had been given a date for the executions, and the method had yet to be confirmed. The other co-defendant was Michael Yowell, who had murdered his own parents in 1998. He became the first person in Texas to be executed by compounded phenobarbital in 2013, and apparently the execution passed without incident or subsequent complaints from the deceased. Obviously. I know it's a joke. But the execution passing without incident is complicated. I think that's complicated because you've paralyzed the person, so you don't really know what they're feeling on the inside, right? And when that paralytic has failed, people are like flailing around on that execution gurney and stuff, which, I don't know, that's really intense. I know it will sound a bit rich that Bart had the audacity to complain about unconstitutional pain and suffering, consider the manner in which his mother and brother were murdered, but I doubt that Bart ever had any genuine concerns about drug purity anyway, as this just seemed to be an effort to keep pushing back the date of his execution until a protracted lawsuit was settled one way or another. Nice idea, but his time was running out. After 11 years of composing 1-star reviews in the Alan B. Polonsky unit, Bart's death warrant was finally signed in November 2017. His execution by lethal injection would take place just a few months later, on the 22nd of February 2018. Things would get underway at about 6 o'clock, as he knows so well. Is this going to be the clemency from the governor or something? The very last roll of the dice for Bart was in the hands of Kent, who made one final desperate plea for mercy to the Texas Board of Pardons and Parole. In recent years, Kent had also turned to writing and had put together a book entitled Murder by Family, which recounted the story so far from his perspective. Thankfully, it appears to have been produced by a respectable publisher rather than Bart's allegedly underground publishing house. Kent's petition for clemency was supported by several inmates and 4 prison guards at death row who attested to Bart's good character and his efforts to rehabilitate both himself and others. The statements in the petition included details on how he had encouraged his fellow inmates to pursue high school diplomas, provided care packages to new inmates, and was generally seen as a calming presence on days when other inmates were losing the plot. One inmate, William Spear, made what I found to be a slightly curious observation. Killing him would be a crime because the system needs men like him, keeping everyone calm and looking forward. There's something to bear in mind for anyone considering committing capital murder and ending up on death row. They could really do with some calmer and more inspirational people in there, if at all possible. Apply in the comments if you think you might plug this gap. I suppose it's entirely possible, though, that William Spear was including prison guards in his call for more men like this in the system, and perhaps suggesting that the current staff could learn a thing or two from Bart. This is because he gets this defense because he's a psychopath and he's excellent at manipulating people. Even with the help of a few inmates and prison guards, which, let's face it, is not quite in the same league as a joint endorsement from the Pope and Snoop Dogg, Kent would still be facing an uphill battle to save his son's life in such a short window of time. Convincing the Texas Board of Pardon and Paroles to recommend clemency would have been a pretty incredible achievement in itself. The board doesn't tend to go for this kind of thing. From the hundreds of other petitions presented to the Texas Board over the last 25 years, a mere 3 have resulted in a recommendation for a commuted sentence, and none of those were a unanimous vote. Even in the unlikely event of securing a recommendation from the board, this would only have been the first baby step. That recommendation goes to the governor of Texas, who makes the ultimate decision on whether the recommendation should be accepted, rejected, or ignored, which is pretty much the same outcome as rejected. Rick Perry was a big supporter of the death penalty, and during his time serving as Texas governor between 2000 and 2015, the state carried out 279 executions. Of those 3 board recommendations for clemency, 2 were rejected by Governor Rick Perry. Although there were examples of other commutations that fell outside of the governor's jurisdiction, Kenneth Foster is the name of the only inmate this millennium to have escaped. Wow, they really don't fuck around in Texas, do they? And this was the only narrow route left on a very wobbly table for Bart Whitaker. The good news for Bart was that Rick Perry was now out of the picture, as he had left office to pursue a second, equally useless presidential campaign. I was wondering why Rick Perry sounded familiar. So he has stepped up to some sort of bigger political career, although it was unsuccessful, so I guess not. The bad news for Bart is that his replacement was Governor Greg Abbott, who is known for his super tough stance on crime and his tendency to speed up the conveyor belt of death sentences and executions. He already had overseen 30 executions during his first 3 years as governor of the state that's often nicknamed the death penalty capital of the world. It would be something of an understatement to say that the prospects were not looking good for Kent's appeal. Yeah, the previous guy was more generous and 1 person got off under him. Yeah, it's not happening, mate. Many would have wondered why Kent was even bothering to try against almost impossible odds, or indeed why his opinion should even be given any serious consideration after Bart's fate had already been decided by a jury 11 years earlier. The fact that Kent was both a victim and the father of the perpetrator on death row certainly makes things a little bit more complex. Kent, who now lived with his new wife Tanya, was still hammering home the point that Bart was his only surviving son, and that to see him executed would only compound his suffering and grief as the single surviving victim. Kent felt that his own opinion and the potential future impact on himself should be taken into account in a state which prides itself on promoting the rights of victims, and he insisted that nobody in the family wanted Bart to die. I have to say, I was a little disconcerted back when Kent stood up at the trial and promised the court that neither Trish nor Kevin would have wanted to see Bart executed. I dare say that he was right, and he obviously knew his wife and youngest son better than any of us. Even under extreme circumstances such as these, I doubt that too many people would want to see members of their own family executed. But I still don't feel that Kent should have been making promises on behalf of the dead, and it's impossible to know for sure what Trish and 19-year-old Kevin would have truly wanted. I also felt uncomfortable about Kent continually wheeling God and his religion into the equation. He's perfectly entitled to his religious beliefs, and it would seem that his faith helped him through this horrific journey. But it's not entirely helpful to declare that God had already forgiven his son when you're talking to a jury or parole board that may not necessarily share your religious beliefs. Fred Feltman had made it very clear that the duty of the jury was to uphold Texan law rather than God's law. As it should be, obviously. Some would argue that whilst Kent's feelings should be considered on some level, it shouldn't be up to a parent to decide how their son is sentenced, and that the court's decision should stand when it comes to protecting the public from killers. Yeah, but I don't think we should be looking at it from Kent as the father's perspective. We should be looking at it as Kent as the victim's perspective, right? But it's worth noting that Kent never once suggested that Bart should ever be released from prison and let back out into the wild. His only plea was that his son be allowed to live out the rest of his life in prison, with no chance of parole. And this itself seems like a pretty harsh scenario when compared to shooter Chris Brashear, who'll be eligible for parole in 2035. Yeah, it does seem disproportional, it just does. I suppose we have to pose the question of who exactly would benefit from the execution of Bart Whitaker. While the families of the victims may often get a sense of justice and closure from executions in some cases, this was clearly not going to be the story here. And if the execution was only going to cause more sorrow and hurt for the victim, who walks out the winner? The general public who clap their hands with glee when justice is served, the serving Texas governor who likes to demonstrate how tough he is on crime by bumping up the numbers? Would that be good enough reason to kill Bart Whitaker? No, I don't think so. Whilst that debate raged on, Kent pressed ahead with the first formidable obstacle of presenting his petition to the Texas Board of Pardons and Parole. I have to admit, I was pretty dumbfounded when I learned how this 7-member board reaches a decision. Okay, I assumed that they'd get the chance to confer with each other and share notes when it came to deciding on making a recommendation on whether a human being should live or die. But no, they each work separately and never actually meet up before their individual votes are submitted. Well, actually, it feels more democratic that way. They're not all like getting together and then one person who's more persuasive is telling the others how to vote. They just get to quietly make their own decisions, and then they go by, I assume that's why it's got an odd number of people? 7 members, yeah. I don't know. I quite like that. The chairman of the board, former sheriff David Gutierrez, spent half an hour listening in person to Kent's appeal without actually asking any questions, whilst another board member spent a couple of hours chatting to Bart himself on death row. But it does seem a bit odd that the board don't exchange their findings or views with each other in order to form a solid decision. I don't know. I don't particularly agree with that. I think it's okay. The US District Judge, Sam Sparks, is one of many who feels that this process falls a bit short, declaring that, quote, a flip of the coin would be more merciful than these votes. No, it wouldn't, Sam. Sorry, I disagree with you completely on that. Kent was always acutely aware that the chances of a majority vote for clemency were slimmer than the chances of Simon getting all the pronunciations exactly right in this 2-hour video. You're goddamn right. The very best outcome that Kent could hope for was a majority vote of 4-3 in favor of clemency. I have a feeling that this is going to happen, I don't know why. Even though all odds should be against it. So it came as more than a bit of a surprise when the board announced its verdict just 2 days before the scheduled execution. Oh my god, leave it to the last minute, don't you? For the first and only time in the history of the modern establishment of the Texas Board of Pardons and Parole in 1937, a unanimous recommendation was made for the commutation of a death sentence. Holy sh... What was that guy's name? The dad's name? Henry? No, Harry? No, it's nothing like that, is it? I'm completely misremembering. Kent! Harry. He must have been extremely persuasive. Prosecutor Fred Felkman was pretty pissed off about this. Of course, it was only a recommendation, and there was still a general expectation that hell would freeze over before Governor Greg Abbott accepted it. But Felkman still vented his frustration at the board's decision to the Houston TV network KTRK. He ranted, I guess the 12 jurors' opinion means nothing to the parole board. Well, it does. They found him guilty. He's still going to be in prison forever. I'm trying to figure out why they think they should commute this, and why the governor should even give it a second thought. I haven't met any person aside from Mr. Kent Whitaker who says justice hasn't been served. The last part wasn't quite true, as Felkman seemed to be forgetting that Trish's brother, Bo, also argued against the death sentence during Bart's trial, although he admittedly went very quiet after this and wasn't involved in subsequent appeals. But whilst the recommendation was a major surprise, there had been no word from Governor Greg Abbott by the time the day of the execution swung around on February the 22nd, 2018. Oh my god, the tension is insane. It was now widely predicted that Abbott wouldn't even acknowledge the recommendation, and as the clock ticked down to 6 p.m., Kent and his new wife Tanya visited Bart for probably the very last time. Kent and Bart pressed their hands on the glass partition and said their goodbyes. Bart was then transported to Huntsville for the actual execution, where he was allowed one final brief phone call with Kent before both parties were informed at 5 p.m. that phone privileges were over. Kent lowered the receiver and wept. It's often reported that word came from Governor Greg Abbott just moments before the execution was due to take place. Some accounts get way too carried away, and the lethal injection was already poised to enter Bart's veins before someone in robes burst in and shouted, "Stop!" It wasn't quite that dramatic, but it was still an extraordinarily close shave. Just 40 minutes before the execution, the news broke that Governor Greg Abbott had signed a proclamation to commute Bart's death sentence to a life sentence in prison without parole. Oh my god, dude, 40 minutes. Why leave it so late? This was a pretty historic moment for Texas. Alongside Kenneth Foster, Bart Whitaker would be only the second criminal this millennium to have his sentence commuted by a governor, and in fact, only the third in history. The other one occurred in 1998 and involved Henry Lee Lucas, otherwise known as the Confession Killer, who had an unfortunate habit of confessing to murders that he never committed. His death sentence was commuted by the serving governor, who went by the name of George W. Bush. The guy went on to find fame for his paintings of world leaders and pets. His portrait of Vladimir Putin was a bit ropey, but he turned in an excellent painting of his own pet dog, a Scottish terrier called Barney. As everyone was still reeling from the shock that Governor Greg Abbott had saved Bart's life with just 40 minutes left on the clock, Abbott happily explained his reasoning behind the decision at great length. Here's a condensed version of what he had to say. The murders of Mr. Whitaker's mother and brother are reprehensible. The crime deserves severe punishment for the criminals who killed him. The recommendation of the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, and my action on it, ensures Mr. Whitaker will never be released from prison. Oh my god, he does go on. Okay. The decision of the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles is supported by the totality of circumstances in this case. The person who fired the gun that killed the victims did not receive the death penalty, but Mr. Whitaker, who did not fire the gun, did get the death penalty. That factor alone may not warrant commutation for someone like Mr. Whitaker, who recruited others to commit murder. Additional factors make the decision more complex. Mr. Whitaker's father, who survived the attempt on his life, passionately opposes the execution of his son. Mr. Whitaker's father insists that he would be victimized again if the state put to death the last remaining immediate family member. Also, Mr. Whitaker voluntarily and forever waived any and all claims to parole in exchange for the commutation of his sentence from death to life without possibility of parole. Moreover, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles unanimously voted for commutation. The totality of these factors warrants a commutation of Mr. Whitaker's death sentence. Mr. Whitaker must spend the remainder of his life behind bars as punishment for this heinous crime. There were naturally tears of joy from Kent Whitaker, who first learned of the news as he was making his way to the death chamber to observe the execution. Do they have to call it the death chamber? Jesus. Bart himself released a short statement which declared that he was thankful, not for himself, but for his dad who had committed no crime. He felt that the system had ultimately come through for Kent and promised that he would do his best to uphold his side of the bargain. Dude, your side of the bargain is just staying in prison forever where you belong. Fred Felkman made no direct statement in regard to the governor's decision, but I imagine it would have gone in lines of, "This is bullshit!" Since 2018, Bart has been held in the William G. McConnell unit in B County, Texas, but life hasn't really changed much for him on the whole, since he still spends the majority of the day in solitary confinement. He receives limited visits from Kent and Tanya, but they can still only talk to him through a glass partition. He may have been saved from the ever-looming prospect of execution, but he hardly got a major bump up in accommodation and lifestyle. I'm not suggesting that we should feel any sympathy for his plight, although I always considered the death sentence to be harsh and unfair. But even though he never fired a shot himself, a young man who led his family back home to be murdered by his mates deserves to spend a very long time in prison. Yes, he does. But we're still left with questions over what exactly could have driven him to continually hatch plots to murder his own family, and whether he is now fully reformed and a regretful character who perhaps even deserves the chance of parole one day in the far future. I don't think so. I think he's a manipulative psychopath, in my opinion. I've been wondering if we're just beginning to see a new epidemic of spoiled rich brat syndrome, which turns overpampered young Americans into killers. The story bears a passing similarity to another case we covered on Casual Criminalist. Affluenza guy, Chandler Halderson, right? 23-year-old in 2024 who was frequently showered with expensive gifts from his devoted parents. Halderson pretended to have graduated from college, made up a fake job working for an insurance company, and later claimed he was on the brink of taking up a job at SpaceX. When his parents were on the brink of discovering that all of this was complete bollocks, oh no, this is a different dude. Wait, there's another guy this bears similarity to, because this guy seems to be an actual murderer, whereas the Affluenza guy, it was manslaughter, right? Or maybe even not, because he got off, didn't he, allegedly? I'm just guessing, I don't remember the case properly. Please don't take my word as fact, because it's probably not. When his parents were on the brink of discovering it was all bollocks, Halderson decided to avoid the embarrassment of being exposed as a fibber by fatally shooting his mum and dad, dismembering their bodies and scattering the remains around southern Wisconsin. Maybe we need to calm down with the Rolex watches and start sending our kids down to the mines again. Yeah, and the lake houses. I'm obviously not serious on that last point, although others have suggested that Bart's unusual upbringing may have somehow enabled his future behavior. He never seemed to face any dramatic consequences from his criminal activity when he was still at school, and maybe it's hard to learn valuable life lessons when you just keep getting forgiven for everything. Indeed. The common belief is that Bart was just a particularly cold and greedy individual who was prepared to have his family murdered in order to seize control of their wealth. But Kent was of the opinion that it was never about the money, and claimed that the family wealth was overinflated in court to fit in with the prosecution's narrative. It wasn't, Kent, it was underinflated, mate, come on. He reckons that Bart suffers from a mental illness that is yet to be recognized, but points out that Bart has been working hard on trying to take control of it and work around the danger points so that he'll never find himself in that mental state again. Our old friend Detective Marshall Slott believes wholeheartedly that Bart is a sociopath who feels that people are there to be used as pieces in a game. Yeah, I'm kind of with the old Marshall here. Wait, no, he's not a marshal, he's a detective, and his name is Marshall. It'd be funny if he became a marshal, then it'd be Marshall. Felkman admits that he's not fully on board with the term sociopath, which he describes as psycholingo and psychobabble. Okay. In his words, the old-time Texas thing was he's just a mean son of a bitch, okay? Yeehaw! Where's my horse? Bart himself briefly considered that he might be a sociopath, but he made an interesting observation to freelance journalist Kelly Krath when she reached out to him by letter. In 2015, he replied, "Sociopathy can be beaten. You just have to work out a different way of arriving at the same destination that other people get to naturally. A simple example, say you see some poor wrench on the sidewalk and feel the need to help this person. But I can arrive at the same action, giving money or code, by designing a set of ethical rules. In this case, that in order for me to maintain my superiority, I am required to help those less fortunate. Whereas your action would depend on empathy, mine would depend on an internal rule. But the result would be the same." You've got to say, fair point, mate. Jesus. Bart has since rejected the idea that he is a sociopath and claims he was simply born with the wrong wiring. Well, yeah, that doesn't mean you can't not a sociopath. Right? But it appears that part of his mission to take control of his condition involves designing himself new sets of ethical rules, which suggests that he hasn't totally abandoned the idea. When talking specifically about the plot to murder his parents, Bart explained to ABC News in 2009 that he and the two other conspirators were wretched human beings who were almost playing a game of chicken with each other to see who would flinch first. The problem was, nobody flinched. He claims that up until the point when the first shot was fired, he didn't really expect the plan to become a reality, because he'd tried it like a few times before. Maybe there was some truth in Adam Hipp's suggestion at the trial that Bart had a problem in distinguishing reality from fiction and really did believe that he could take on the mantle of Kaiser Soze from the usual suspects and slip away from the authorities without facing any consequences, which he did for like a year. Bart also returned to the idea that he was struggling to earn the affection of his parents and felt that he was becoming a hopeless failure, leading to a situation in which he sought revenge on his parents for being alive. He has since recognized that this was completely wrong, but insists it was just how he felt at the time. There may well have been some strange things erupting in his head over 20 years ago, but should such a deeply troubled individual ever be freed from prison? You might find it odd that I'm even asking the question, as the governor's proclamation made it clear that parole isn't on the table, but I predict the matter is going to pop up one day. Kent Whitaker is convinced that his son is a fully reformed character, and has since expressed his desire for improved visitation conditions, including open visits, in which he can physically hug his son, suggesting perhaps that Kent does not quite consider the fight to be over. Bart, too, is still battling away with the system. He's currently involved in a class action lawsuit against the state, which challenges the cruel conditions of death row. Some might find it admirable that he's leading the charge over this, considering that he's no longer on death row. More cynical souls might suggest that his relentless and selfless campaigning for reforms is another calculated strategy to demonstrate that he himself is a reformed character and perhaps worthy of release one day. This is one of those things where I don't really care. I'm like, if he's doing something good, well, I don't care what the reason is. Just go ahead. And, the parole board will either see through it or they won't, but there probably won't be a parole board. Here's a point that often gets missed. It's a 2012 quote from Bart Whitaker, lifted from the Minutes Before 6 blog. This was back when he thought he was facing the death penalty, and the since deleted paragraph addresses his thoughts on the prospect of a life sentence without parole, and it reads, "Life without parole offends and assaults everything I believe in. It irrevocably denies any possibility of rehabilitation. It eviscerates hope entirely. It is for this reason that I would never sign for it, even if that were the only way to evade a return to death row." He's also entitled to change his mind. He's obviously changed his mind at some point, but I do wonder about the end game. It was always Kent that did all the heavy lifting when it came to petitioning for clemency, and it sometimes feels as if Bart was just shrugging and coasting along with the idea for his dad's sake. Maybe he just wanted to make Kent happy as he felt he owed him something. Don't think so. I don't think his brain works that way. Which would be putting it bloody mildly. It's strange to think that if the murder plot had worked out entirely as planned, then Bart would be dead by now, as there wouldn't be anyone left to speak up for him. But I suspect that the rage against the machine is always going to continue in one form or another, and may eventually lead to a scenario in which the focus switches to why a rehabilitated gentleman needs to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Because sometimes the crime is that heinous. We can only guess whether Bart is really a reformed character or is still very much a shrewd manipulator, maneuvering his human pieces on a real-life Ludo board in an ultimate bid to reach the home square in center. That's what he's doing. I 100% believe he is. He could be reformed at the same time as being a manipulator. He can be doing good things, but I think he's still he's just moving human pieces about. He's just like a chess person. That's all he sees. He just sees pieces. They're not real people to him, in my opinion. I would love to believe Kent when he insists that his son is a changed man, and you'd think that he knows the real Bart better than most. Or would you? Considering Kent's track record of misplaced trust and blind denial over the course of many years, perhaps he's the last person in the world we should be taking seriously. That charming family photograph snapped at the Papadu restaurant might have marked the final chapter in the lives of a blissfully ignorant family living the dream in Sugarland. But there may well be further plot twists on the horizon for the one guy in that photograph who knew what was coming. The guy who now calls himself Thomas Bartlett Whitaker, M.A., but is more commonly known to his friends and surviving family as simply Bart. Thank you for watching.